Hey guys, tonight we're going to step into a world that's going to make you want to hug your pillow a little tighter and maybe double check the lock on your door. Not because someone's coming in, but because you'll be imagining the sheer number of people crammed in around you. You're about to wake up in Victorian London, inside a room where space is a luxury, air is shared, and privacy is something you've only read about in books. Trust me, you probably won't survive this without feeling at least a little grateful for the mattress you're on right now. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is right now. Seriously, it's wild to think some of you are lying in bed in New York while others are on a train in Melbourne. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You open your eyes, and the first thing that hits you isn't the sight of the dingy ceiling overhead. It's the sound. A wet cough from somewhere at the foot of the bed, the shifting of someone's feet on the rough wooden floor, the creak of the bed frame as someone rolls over. And yes, that faint, ever-present murmur of breathing. So many breaths, so close together, that it almost feels like one single creature inhaling and exhaling in rhythm. Your bed, if you could call it that, isn't yours alone. You share it with at least one other person, maybe your younger brother, maybe a stranger who pays for the space by the night. The mattress is lumpy, its stuffing uneven from years of use. The blanket is more holes than fabric, and the room, it's maybe 10 feet by 12 feet. The size of a walk-in closet in some modern houses. Only this closet is home to 6, 7, sometimes even 8 people. The air is damp. It clings to your skin the way a wet shirt sticks after the rain. The walls are always wet to the touch. Even in summer, the plaster stained with long streaks of water damage. In the corners, a pale green fuzz has taken root, mold. Though no one in the room bothers naming it, they've all learned not to notice. If you keep your eyes away from it, it almost isn't there. Almost. Historians still argue whether the majority of the working poor in London's East End truly had no choice but to live in such numbers, or if some landlords simply maximized profit by cutting rooms smaller and renting them to more bodies than any human health could stand. What we do know is that the census records from the mid-19th century read like overcrowding horror stories. Addresses with more than 50 names listed, multiple families wedged into single rooms. You stretch your legs, but there's nowhere for them to go without bumping into another body. The room smells lived in, but not in a cozy, freshly baked bread way. It's a mix of unwashed clothing, damp wood, coal smoke, and the sour, sweet tang of too many people breathing the same air. You instinctively take a shallow breath, but even that feels thick. There's no real furniture besides the beds, rickety frames, some nothing more than planks laid on crates. A chipped wash basin sits in one corner, its water cloudy from yesterday's use. One small chest holds everyone's clothes, stacked in messy piles. And the floorboards? They groan with every step, as if warning you that they've had just about enough of holding this many people. From outside, the sound of horse hooves and carriage wheels rolls in, blending with the occasional hawker's cry. This is a crowded street, and the building is thin-walled. Everything seeps in. Noise, cold, even the smell of whatever the neighbors are cooking or burning. You think of your modern double-glazed windows and smile grimly. If you're unlucky enough to be at the bottom of the social ladder, your night's sleep might not even happen in a bed at all. Some lodging houses rented penny sits, where you could literally sit on a bench, leaning forward to rest your head on a rope strung across the room. That rope was the only thing keeping you from slumping to the floor. A slightly pricier option, the fourpenny coffin, gave you a narrow wooden box with a thin sheet. The name wasn't ironic. It looked exactly like what you're picturing. There's a strange intimacy to this kind of living. You can tell who's home without opening your eyes, just from the sound of their breathing. You know who had onions for dinner, who snores, whose feet shuffle more when they're nervous. But intimacy isn't always comfort. In a space this tight, every cough, every sneeze, every whispered argument belongs to everyone. Illness travels through the room like gossip. It doesn't take long to reach everyone's ears or lungs. You push yourself upright, careful not to bump the person sleeping beside you. Your bare feet hit the floor and find the cool slickness of a puddle, condensation, or maybe rainwater leaking in. You wipe them on your blanket without thinking. That blanket's seen worse. The window, if you're lucky enough to have one, is small and set high in the wall, letting in only a sliver of pale morning light. It's streaked with soot from the endless chimneys outside. Privacy? Forget it. You dress in the same room where you sleep, eat, and wash, with others doing the same. You've learned the subtle art of turning your back just enough to grant the illusion of privacy, even when you're 2 feet apart. Doors stay open because they swell in the damp and don't close properly anyway. And yet, for all its discomfort, this is still home. You've grown used to stepping over people to get to the door, to ducking your head so you don't hit the low ceiling beam. You've learned to read the room without speaking. Whether someone's in the mood to talk, whether that patch of floor is safe to walk on, whether you should offer the last scrap of bread or keep it for yourself. Some historians point out that this forced proximity built a kind of community. Neighbors who would share tea, watch each other's children, or lend a candle when yours burned out. Others countered that the stress of living in such cramped quarters bred resentment, suspicion, and even violence. Both are probably true, depending on the night, the neighbors, and whether anyone managed to bring home enough food. As you move toward the small table by the wall, you pass the water jug. You know from experience that what's inside isn't fresh. Most likely it was filled from a street pump the night before. You glance into the cloudy water and decide to skip it for now. There's no escaping the sounds from upstairs, a different family stomping around, a baby crying, someone hacking up phlegm. The floor between you is so thin that when they spill water, it sometimes drips through. And beneath you, a workshop that bangs and clangs from dawn to dusk, the air smelling faintly of hot metal. You think of the luxury of solitude, closing a door, turning a lock, having a space where no one else's breath mingles with yours. Here, solitude is something you get only by leaving the building entirely, and even then, the street outside is a crush of people, carts, and animals. As the day begins, you're reminded of one unshakable fact. In this part of Victorian London, the idea of personal space is as fanciful as a flying carriage. You live pressed against other lives, stitched into a single, crowded fabric. And there's no unpicking that seam without losing everything else that holds you here by midday. The cramped streets of London had grown hotter, and the smells of the neighborhood began to bloom under the summer sun. The grinding wheels of horse-drawn carts on cobblestones, the shouts of hawkers, and the high-pitched cries of children fighting over a scrap of bread all merged into a chaotic symphony the Victorian poor knew by heart. In this world, the idea of taking a bath bore little resemblance to what we know today. Working-class families rarely had the chance to soak in a warm tub. Instead, they relied on small basins and a single jug of cold water, often fetched from a public pump. Washing was done quickly. Face, neck, hands, and that was it. The rest of the body could wait until some other day. In fact, many firmly believed that bathing too often could weaken the body, leaving it vulnerable to dangerous chills or illness. Among the narrow alleyways, some families tried to maintain a shred of decency by wiping themselves down with a cloth dipped in vinegar and water, trusting that the sharp scent would mask body odor. Those with a little more money might afford soap, a luxury made from animal fat and lye, with a caustic smell so strong it often had to be softened with dried flowers or essential oils. And hair? Forget silky shampoos. The Victorians had their own curious recipes. Some swore by beaten egg yolks to clean their hair, believing the protein would nourish it. Others preferred strong black tea or apple cider vinegar rinses. Gentlemen wanting a sleek, shiny style would smooth their hair with lard mixed with lavender oil, a combination that was pleasantly scented at first, but prone to turning rancid in hot weather. In poorer districts, hair washing might happen just once a month. In between, hair was pinned up, braided, or tamed with a fine-toothed comb. If bathing was rare, laundering clothes was an even greater ordeal. Washing by hand meant hours of hard labor over a tub of cold or lukewarm water. Before soap became more affordable in the later 19th century, laundry might be done with chalk to whiten fabrics, ashes for scrubbing, or even stale urine. Its ammonia content acted as a natural cleanser, though it left a scent that lingered stubbornly in humid weather. For women, laundry day was physically punishing. Clothes were scrubbed on washboards until hands were raw and chapped. Water had to be fetched, boiled, and carried, often up and down narrow stairs. Then came the wringing, hanging, and waiting for the sun or the damp London air to finish the job. Since most households couldn't manage this more than once every few weeks, clothing absorbed the daily grime of work, cooking smoke, and city dust until it was practically stiff. Underwear, as we think of it, wasn't universally worn. Men might go without entirely, while women wore a single long chemise beneath their dresses. These garments were washed less often than you'd expect, sometimes only once a month, making them far from fresh. Layered clothing trapped not only heat but also odors, and without regular washing, the human scent became as much a part of the environment as the smell of coal smoke. Even for the better-off middle class, hygiene habits were shaped by convenience and prevailing medical ideas. Doctors and moralists warned that excessive bathing could be dangerous, sapping energy or leading to nervous disorders. A quick sponge bath, a comb through the hair, and a splash of cologne or rosewater were considered more than adequate for daily grooming. Outside the home, the streets themselves added to the constant assault on the senses. Horse manure was everywhere, trodden into the mud by countless boots and cartwheels. Rubbish piled in corners until it was carted away, sometimes days later. In poorer neighborhoods, gutters ran with dirty water, kitchen waste, and worse. The night soil men tasked with emptying outdoor privies, carried their sloshing buckets through the streets before dawn, their presence signaled by a stench that turned stomachs. By early afternoon, the city seemed to settle into a routine, markets buzzing, factories thundering, chimney sweeps darting through lanes blackened with soot. Yet beneath the rhythm of daily life, grime and odors never fully receded. They clung to clothes, seeped into homes, and became part of what it meant to live in the heart of Victorian London. A place where soap was a small luxury, water wasn't always clean, and the battle against dirt was fought and lost every single day. By evening, the streets of Victorian London changed character. The heat of the day faded, but the mingled smells of the city remained thick in the air. Coal smoke from household stoves, the sour tang of spilled beer outside taverns, the faint rot of uncollected refuse. Gas lamps flickered to life, casting a yellowish glow over damp cobblestones. Inside cramped working-class homes, hygiene became an even lower priority. The priority now was rest, feet aching from hours of labor, backs sore from lifting and bending. Many families didn't have running water indoors, so washing up before supper meant stepping outside to a shared pump or filling a jug from the public standpipe. In some neighborhoods, residents queued with buckets after work, chatting idly while they waited for their turn. But the water could be cloudy, even contaminated, and it was never wasted on full baths unless absolutely necessary. Children were usually wiped down with a damp cloth, their hair brushed and tied back. Dirt under fingernails stayed put until laundry day, if it came soon. Women, after cooking over smoky stoves, often smelled of coal and onions. Men returning from work at the docks, factories, or foundries brought home the metallic tang of iron dust, the sourness of sweat, and the sharp bite of chemicals used in manufacturing. No scented soap could mask it completely. Perfume and cologne were a different story. Even among the poor, small bottles of cheap scent could be bought at markets or from peddlers, offering at least the illusion of cleanliness. Strong floral waters, lavender oil, and lemon verbena were dabbed onto handkerchiefs or the skin, masking unpleasant odors just long enough for social calls or church visits. Among the wealthier classes, entire toilette rituals revolved around fragrance, powdering hair, applying scented pomades, and sprinkling the body with rosewater. But the wealthier homes, too, had their limits. Even with servants to carry hot water upstairs, bathing was often a weekly affair at best. Large tin tubs were hauled into bedrooms or washrooms, filled by buckets carried from the kitchen stove. A full soak was still seen by some as an indulgence rather than a necessity. And despite the grand appearance of a London townhouse, its drains might be just as foul-smelling as those in poorer districts, since the city's sewer system was still developing. Public bathhouses offered another solution, especially for the working poor. For a few pennies, a person could enjoy a hot soak in a private cubicle if they were lucky enough to live near one. These establishments, often run by charities or reformers, were promoted as a way to improve health and morality among the lower classes. Reformers argued that clean bodies would lead to cleaner minds, less disease, and a more orderly society. Attendance was steady, though not everyone was convinced. Old fears persisted that too much bathing might open the pores and let in illness. The concern with miasma, bad air, was central to Victorian thinking about hygiene. Before the germ theory of disease gained wide acceptance, many believed that foul smells themselves caused illness. This belief gave rise to both practical and decorative measures. Streets were sprinkled with disinfectant powders, homes were aired out daily, and pots of burning herbs or vinegar were set on windowsills to purify the air. The middle and upper classes favored ornate vinaigrettes, small decorative containers filled with scented sponges to hold under the nose in unpleasant surroundings. At night, the city was quieter but never truly still. The work of cleaning, or attempting to, continued in its own way. The nightmen still emptied cesspits and privies. Street sweepers cleared the day's debris from major thoroughfares, though the smaller alleys remained filthy. Households prepared for the next day by shaking rugs out of windows, brushing soot from mantels, and wiping away the worst of the grime from tables and floors. Hygiene in the Victorian era was thus a constant balancing act between tradition and change, between fear of disease and fear of overindulgence, between the desire for cleanliness and the harsh realities of urban life. For most, it was a battle fought piecemeal, with small victories, a washed face, a combed head of hair, a freshly laundered shirt that might stay clean for a single day. Looking back, it's tempting to judge these habits by modern standards. Yet in the context of their time, when water had to be hauled by hand, heating it was a laborious task, and medical advice often warned against excessive bathing, the Victorian approach to hygiene was practical, even sensible. What seems to us like neglect was, for them, simply the normal rhythm of life in a city bursting at the seams, where soap, water, and privacy were precious commodities, and where the fight against dirt was never truly won. In Victorian Britain, what people ate revealed almost everything about their place in society. The wealth of the industrial upper classes and the hunger of the urban poor played out not just in wages and housing, but on the dinner plate. In London especially, food was a visible marker of status. A person's meals could range from lavish multi-course banquets served under glittering chandeliers to a meager hunk of stale bread eaten on a damp stoop. For the working poor, diet was dictated by cost and availability, not by taste or nutrition. Bread, often made from coarsely milled flour that might be adulterated with chalk or alum to make it appear whiter, was the staple. Dripping, saved from roasted meats, was spread on bread for flavor. Tea, heavily sweetened with sugar, was a daily comfort, though milk was often scarce or watered down. Protein came sparingly, a small portion of bacon, perhaps a herring or mackerel from a street hawker, or a stew bulked out with potatoes and onions. Vegetables were seasonal and limited, with cabbage, turnips, and carrots being the most common. Street food was essential for those who had neither the means nor the facilities to cook at home. Vendors wheeled carts piled with hot pies, roasted chestnuts, baked potatoes, and eels stewed in a thick parsley liquor. Some sold slices of pudding or treacle-covered bread, while others offered fried fish wrapped in paper. The smell of sizzling oil, mingled with coal smoke and the sour reek of the streets, was part of the city's daily soundtrack. For a penny or two, a laborer could buy a filling, if not always sanitary, meal without setting foot in a kitchen. Markets were the beating heart of the Victorian food supply. Billingsgate bustled with fishmongers shouting their wares, their counters gleaming with cod, haddock, and oysters. Smithfield The city's great meat market was a chaotic, noisy place, the cobbles slick with blood and sawdust. Here, butchers in blood-stained aprons hacked at sides of beef and mutton, while drovers urged frightened cattle into pens. For the poor, the market's cheapest cuts, the offal, the bones, the scraps, were the most affordable. These would be boiled into soups or stews, eking out their meager nutrition over several meals. In stark contrast, the middle and upper classes approached dining as a performance as much as a necessity. A proper Victorian dinner party was an exercise in etiquette, wealth, and culinary ambition. Meals could consist of as many as 12 courses, served in carefully choreographed sequence. The table would be set with fine china, silverware, and crystal, the dishes arranged in symmetrical patterns. Footmen in livery glided between guests, offering delicacies like turtle soup, roast pheasant, lobster patties, and elaborate molded jellies. For the wealthy, breakfast alone might consist of multiple hot dishes, kedgeree, sausages, grilled kidneys, eggs, fresh bread, butter, and marmalade, washed down with tea, coffee, or even wine. Luncheon might be lighter but still far from simple, often featuring cold meats, pies, and fresh fruit. Afternoon tea, an institution in its own right, bridged the gap between lunch and dinner with dainty sandwiches, scones with clotted cream, and a selection of cakes. Behind these grand meals was an army of servants. In the kitchens of large houses, cooks presided over ranges that could roast, bake, and boil all at once. Scullery maids scrubbed pots, prepared vegetables, and kept the kitchen fires burning. Food was ordered from trusted suppliers, fishmongers, butchers, greengrocers, who delivered fresh goods daily. Even the ice for chilled desserts and drinks was imported in great blocks from Norway, stored in insulated ice houses. The Victorian obsession with propriety extended to the food itself. Certain dishes were associated with certain occasions, and breaking those unspoken rules could be a social misstep. Turtle soup, for example, was considered a prestigious dish for formal dinners, while serving mutton at a high society gathering might be seen as rustic and inappropriate. Presentation was everything. Garnishes were chosen for symmetry, sauces poured with precision, and desserts often took the form of architectural marvels made from sugar and spun glass. Yet even among the wealthy, Victorian food was not without its hazards. Before modern food safety laws, contamination was common. Milk might carry tuberculosis, oysters could spread typhoid, and tinned meats sometimes caused food poisoning. Wealth protected against hunger, but not always against illness. Cookbooks and household manuals of the time often devoted entire sections to choosing the freshest ingredients and avoiding unscrupulous vendors, warning readers against the dangers of unwholesome food. For the middle classes, those shopkeepers, clerks, teachers, and professionals who formed the backbone of Victorian respectability, meals were simpler than those of the elite but still aimed to reflect refinement. A Sunday roast with potatoes and greens was a centerpiece of family life, and homemade puddings were a source of pride. These families might not afford turtle soup or quail, but they valued cleanliness, regular meal times, and the moral discipline associated with good table manners. As the century progressed, new influences began to creep into the British diet. The empire's reach brought spices, teas, and exotic fruits into London shops. Bananas, Once a rare curiosity became more common. Curry powders appeared in middle-class kitchens, and tinned pineapple or peaches became fashionable additions to dessert tables. The railways also transformed the food supply, allowing fresh produce to travel from rural farms to urban markets in a fraction of the time. Still, the gulf between rich and poor remained stark. A wealthy family might enjoy imported wine, fresh game, and elaborate pastries, while a dockworker's family might subsist on bread, tea, and the occasional scrap of meat. For many in the lower classes, hunger was a constant companion, and malnutrition shaped both health and life expectancy. The Victorian table, then, was not merely about sustenance. It was a mirror of the era's inequalities, traditions, and ambitions. A stag for those who could not afford the services of a barber surgeon or the increasingly popular dental mechanics that cropped up in wealthier districts. Dental care often fell into the hands of opportunists. Street dentists would set up shop right in the middle of a busy market, their tools laid out on a cloth like a display of knives in a butcher's stall. Passers-by could have a tooth extracted for a penny, sometimes half that if they agreed to be a public spectacle, drawing a crowd and drumming up more customers. The extraction process was rarely quick. The instruments, iron pliers, hooked tools, and crude levers, were not sterilized, and the pain was often worsened by the hesitation or clumsiness of the operator. Children were sometimes held down by their parents while their rotting teeth were removed. Those unlucky enough to have more complicated dental problems, like abscesses, often faced a far worse fate. The infection could spread, leading to swelling, fever, and, in severe cases, death. For the middle class, the experience was marginally better, though not by much. Dentists working out of proper shops used finer instruments and might offer rudimentary fillings made of gold leaf, tin foil, or even lead. Lead fillings, unfortunately, carried their own long-term dangers, but this was not widely understood. False teeth, too, were available, constructed from ivory, bone, or in the most expensive cases, human teeth. The latter were often sourced from executed criminals or even stolen from graves, a grim practice that earned them the nickname Waterloo teeth, after the battle where scavengers collected thousands from the fallen. Preventative care was still a rare concept. Tooth powders were marketed as a luxury item, available in chemist shops, made from ground cuttlefish bone, charcoal, or chalk, with flavorings like peppermint or cinnamon. But for the poor, brushing, if it happened at all, was done with a rag wrapped around the finger, dipped in salt or ashes from the hearth. Infections in the mouth were not seen as distinct from other illnesses. A bad toothache might be treated with bloodletting, cupping, or applying heated objects to the face in the hope of drawing out the bad humors. Herbal remedies abounded. Clove oil, alum, and tinctures of myrrh were popular choices for numbing pain. Some old folk beliefs even suggested carrying a rabbit's tooth in one's pocket to prevent tooth decay, though whether anyone truly believed it worked or simply hoped for luck is hard to say. Children often bore the brunt of neglect. Teething was considered a dangerous period for infants, with some Victorian doctors blaming it for fevers, convulsions, or even death. In extreme cases, gums were lanced with sharp instruments to help teeth erupt and act more likely to cause infection than relief. Without modern orthodontics, Crooked or crowded teeth were simply accepted, though among the wealthy, there was growing interest in devices to improve one's smile. The cultural perception of teeth was complex. In a society obsessed with propriety and appearances, bad teeth could mark someone as lower class. Yet even the wealthy struggled to keep them healthy. Smiles in portraits from the era are often tight-lipped, not just due to formal fashion, but to hide dental flaws. By the latter half of the century, reformers and health advocates began to campaign for better public awareness. Articles in popular magazines warned of the dangers of neglect, and some schools, particularly in more progressive boroughs, introduced rudimentary dental inspections for children. Yet, these efforts barely scratched the surface of the problem in overcrowded urban slums. Meanwhile, the shadow of superstition still loomed large. Some families believed that toothaches were caused by tiny worms burrowing into the tooth, a belief with ancient roots. It was not uncommon for a sufferer to rinse their mouth with vinegar or spirits in the hope of drowning these imagined pests. In short, Victorian dental care was a spectrum ranging from gruesome improvisation to the earliest glimmers of modern practice, a reflection of the era's broader tension between tradition and scientific progress. By the 1880s, dentistry was beginning to find a more solid professional footing. Dental schools were established in London, Edinburgh, and other major cities, training practitioners in anatomy, hygiene, and the use of new tools. The introduction of foot-powered dental drills in the 1870s made it possible to remove decay with far more precision than the crude scraping instruments of earlier decades. Still, the experience was noisy, slow, and often agonizing without proper anesthesia. Chloroform and ether, introduced to surgery in the mid-19th century, were sometimes used in dental extractions for those who could afford it. However, many patients feared these substances, and there were genuine risks involved. Improper dosage could lead to serious complications or death. More commonly, nitrous oxide, laughing gas, was offered in dental surgeries catering to the middle and upper classes. This provided a safer, if still imperfect, means of pain control, though some Victorians viewed the drug's euphoric effects as morally questionable. In wealthier households, regular visits to the dentist were slowly becoming a norm. The emphasis on preventive care was growing, with practitioners advising on diet, the dangers of excessive sugar, and the benefits of cleaning the teeth daily. Imported toothbrushes, often with handles made of bone or ivory and bristles from boar hair, were sold in chemist shops alongside jars of tooth powder. Advertisements promised pearly white smiles and fresh breath, though in truth, the powders could be so abrasive that they damaged enamel over time. The middle class, eager to imitate aristocratic habits, embraced these products, while the poor relied on cheaper, homemade solutions. A mixture of baking soda and water was one popular alternative. Another was rubbing the teeth with crushed sage leaves, which left a strong herbal taste. These home remedies were better than nothing, but without consistent care and access to professional treatment, decay was inevitable. Dental prosthetics also became more sophisticated during this period. Vulcanized rubber, introduced in the 1850s, revolutionized false teeth by providing a durable, moldable base for artificial dentures. This made them more affordable than the carved ivory or gold-mounted sets previously favored by the elite. Even so, dentures remained out of reach for the working poor, who, if they lost most of their teeth, simply lived without them. In industrial cities like Manchester, Birmingham, and Glasgow, the scale of dental disease among the working class was staggering. Poor nutrition, sugar-laden tea, and the lack of medical services combined to create generations plagued by tooth loss and infection. Public health reformers began to sound alarms, pointing out that poor dental health was not just a matter of appearance but one that could seriously affect a person's ability to work and maintain their overall health. Some of the earliest dental charities were formed in this climate. In London, the Metropolitan Free Hospital began offering dental services for the poor in the late 19th century. Volunteer dentists provided extractions and emergency treatment, but preventative education lagged far behind. Many patients only sought help when the pain was unbearable, by which point the tooth was beyond saving. Attitudes toward dentistry also carried a heavy class dimension. Among the wealthy, having straight, white teeth was a mark of refinement and discipline, while in the slums, bad teeth were simply an accepted reality of life. This divide only reinforced the perception that health, and by extension, morality, was tied to social status. A bright smile could open doors in polite society, just as a mouth full of gaps could close them. Literature of the era occasionally touched on these differences. In Dickens' novels, for instance, characters' teeth are sometimes used as shorthand for their health, wealth, or moral character. Similarly, in the burgeoning world of advertising, a dazzling smile became shorthand for success, respectability, and romantic desirability. By the turn of the century, the groundwork had been laid for modern dental practice. The Dental Act of 1878 had restricted the title of dentist to those properly trained and registered, helping to weed out the more dangerous quacks. Science was catching up with tradition, with germ theory reshaping the understanding of decay and infection. But despite these advances, the benefits were still unevenly distributed. A factory worker in the East End of London could expect little more than an extraction for a rotten tooth, while a banker's wife in Kensington might enjoy a gold filling and a gleaming set of false teeth. The Victorian approach to dental care, like so many aspects of the era, was a study in contrasts, progress and superstition, innovation and neglect, privilege and poverty. It was a world where someone could be fitted with a finely crafted denture made from imported ivory, while another person just streets away had their tooth yanked out in a filthy alley. As the 20th century dawned, reformers hoped that dental care would follow the same path as other public health initiatives, becoming more accessible, more hygienic, and more preventive. But in the Victorian period itself, the mouth remained both a source of pride and a silent marker of inequality, an area where pain was endured with stoicism and where the smile one could show the world depended heavily on the circumstances of birth. If Victorian dentistry revealed the era's sharp divide between wealth and poverty, Victorian medicine as a whole told a similar story, one of rapid scientific advancement coexisting with outdated beliefs, home remedies, and a sometimes alarming tolerance for discomfort. By the middle of the 19th century, Britain was undergoing a medical revolution. The rise of professional training, the establishment of hospitals in major cities, and breakthroughs in anesthesia and antisepsis promised better care than ever before. But in practice, the experience of being a patient still depended greatly on one's social class, location, and luck. For the upper and middle classes, a network of private doctors and well-equipped hospitals offered increasingly sophisticated treatments. A wealthy Londoner could call upon a physician who had studied at Edinburgh or Oxford, read the latest medical journals, and used modern instruments. These doctors carried elegant leather cases filled with stethoscopes, thermometers, and syringes, a far cry from the improvised tools of previous centuries. They could prescribe imported medicines like quinine for malaria or opium tinctures for pain, and their surgeries might even be performed under chloroform anesthesia, introduced in Britain in 1847. In contrast, working class and rural patients often relied on a patchwork of local healers, charitable clinics, and traditional remedies. In remote villages, the village bone setter might treat fractures with splints fashioned from wood, while herbalists dispensed infusions of chamomile, peppermint, or comfrey for everything from stomach aches to fevers. Many people still sought out remedies passed down through families: mustard poultices for chest congestion, vinegar-soaked cloths for headaches, and goose fat rubbed on the skin to treat chills. These methods were comforting but often only marginally effective. In cities, the industrial age had created a new set of medical challenges. Overcrowded housing, polluted water, and poor sanitation led to outbreaks of cholera, typhoid, and tuberculosis. The famous cholera epidemics of 1831 to 32, 1848 to 49, and 1854 each claimed thousands of lives, with the poor suffering disproportionately. It was not until John Snow's groundbreaking work on waterborne disease in the 1850s that a clearer understanding of contagion began to influence public health policy. Hospitals reflected these inequalities. Prestigious institutions like Guy's and St. Bartholomew's in London were at the forefront of surgical innovation, but they often catered to paying patients or selected charity cases. In the poorer districts, overcrowded infirmaries struggled with limited resources, understaffing, and outdated facilities. Patients might be crammed into wards with little privacy, where the smell of carbolic acid, a disinfectant introduced by Joseph Lister in the 1860s, mingled with the metallic scent of blood and the damp chill of unheated rooms. Surgery itself was undergoing a transformation. Before the introduction of anesthesia, operations were a brutal race against time, with surgeons prized for their speed. By the 1870s, chloroform and ether had made it possible to perform more complex procedures without the agony that once accompanied them. However, anesthesia carried risks, and some Victorians were reluctant to trust it. Reports of patients dying from overdoses or respiratory failures circulated widely, leading some to choose to remain conscious during surgery despite the pain. Antisepsis was another major leap forward, though it took decades to gain full acceptance. Lister's insistence on sterilizing instruments and using carbolic spray dramatically reduced post-operative infections, but older surgeons were often resistant to change. In some hospitals, instruments were still wiped on an apron between patients, and surgical dressings might be reused. The slow spread of germ theory meant that even in the 1890s, preventable infections were still a leading cause of death. For women, medical care in the Victorian period was shaped by deeply ingrained beliefs about femininity and the body. Many doctors viewed women as naturally delicate and prone to nervous disorders. Conditions like hysteria, a catch-all diagnosis for symptoms ranging from anxiety to fainting, were treated with methods that ranged from rest cures to electrical stimulation. Gynecology was still in its infancy, and childbirth, while safer than in previous centuries, remained dangerous without access to trained midwives or doctors. In wealthier households, births were increasingly attended by physicians, but in working-class homes, They were often handled by experienced older women in the community with little formal training. The Victorians also had a complicated relationship with pain. While pain relief was valued, there was still a moral undercurrent suggesting that enduring discomfort could be virtuous or character building. This belief sometimes led to undertreatment, particularly among the poor, who were expected to bear up under illness rather than seek costly care. At the same time, opium-based medicines were widely available in the form of laudanum and soothing syrups, which could be purchased without a prescription. These remedies provided genuine relief, but also carried a high risk of addiction, something the Victorians only dimly understood. Public health reforms slowly began to address some of these problems. The Public Health Act of 1848 created a central board to oversee sanitation, drainage, and water supply, marking the first real attempt at coordinated health policy. Later acts in the 1870s and 1890s expanded these powers, leading to improvements in waste disposal, clean water access, and housing standards. Vaccination campaigns, starting with smallpox, further reduced mortality rates, though resistance to compulsory vaccination was strong in some communities. By the end of the century, the medical profession had a more organized structure. The Medical Act of 1858 had established the General Medical Council to regulate training and registration, helping to eliminate many unqualified practitioners. Medical journals and conferences promoted the exchange of ideas, and a sense of professional identity began to emerge. Yet for all this progress, the average Victorian still faced a precarious relationship with illness. A simple infection could still be fatal, and access to the best treatments was largely a privilege of the wealthy. The Victorian era was thus a paradox, a time when medicine made extraordinary strides but could still be frighteningly primitive, when a London surgeon might perform a pioneering operation while a rural laborer relied on herbs and prayers. It was an age of discovery, yet also one in which illness was a constant presence, a reminder that science was only beginning to loosen the grip of disease on daily life. But while royal courts and glittering salons displayed the grandeur of aristocratic life, the realities of day-to-day etiquette among the middle and working classes were far more nuanced, and, in many ways, stricter. Manners were not just about social grace. They were a moral currency. In an age when one's character was scrutinized more than one's resume, even the smallest breach of propriety could have lasting consequences. Consider the dinner table. Among the middle classes, meals were not simply about nourishment, but about reinforcing a family's moral fiber. Children were drilled in the rules of polite eating. Sit upright, chew with the mouth closed, never speak with food in the mouth, and never, under any circumstances, reach across the table. Even the way one held cutlery was a subtle class marker. In polite society, the fork was held in the left hand, the knife in the right, and any deviation suggested a lack of refinement. Invitations to dine were themselves rituals of etiquette. A handwritten note, penned in careful copperplate script, was sent at least several days in advance. The recipient was expected to respond promptly, within 24 hours if possible. A delayed reply hinted at hesitation or, worse, disdain. Declining without a suitable excuse could be interpreted as a deliberate insult. For women, etiquette was a constant performance. From the moment they stepped into public, they were judged on posture, diction, dress, and even the way they acknowledged acquaintances. A curtsy had to be measured. Too deep was theatrical. Too shallow could be seen as flippant. Gloves were not simply accessories. They were shields of propriety. A lady without gloves in certain public places risked being mistaken for a servant or, worse, a woman of questionable reputation. Men's etiquette, though less bound by elaborate gestures, carried its own weight of expectation. A gentleman offered his arm to a lady when walking, but only on the side farthest from the street, so she would be shielded from passing carts splashing mud. He was expected to raise his hat, not remove it entirely, when greeting a lady, holding it just above the head with a subtle bow. To fail in this was not merely impolite, but a breach of the invisible code that governed respectable society. Conversation was perhaps the most finely tuned instrument of Victorian etiquette. Topics such as politics, religion, and personal finance were considered dangerous ground, especially in mixed company. Instead, polite talk revolved around literature, music, the weather, and carefully neutral observations about current events. Flattery, when used, had to be understated. Too much suggested insincerity. Too little hinted at arrogance. The home itself was a stage for etiquette. A hostess was judged by her ability to make guests feel both welcome and subtly impressed. Parlor rooms were arranged to encourage conversation, with chairs and settees placed at deliberate angles. Calling cards played a vital role in this social choreography. Small, neatly engraved rectangles left on a silver tray in the entryway. The exchange of cards was not merely about arranging visits. It was a quiet exchange of social standing, an acknowledgement of mutual respect, or its absence. For those living in smaller towns or rural areas, these rules were sometimes softened by familiarity, but even there, reputation was a fragile thing. A misjudged remark at a church gathering, a failure to greet a neighbor, or an over-familiar tone in a letter could spark gossip that lingered for years. Importantly, etiquette was not just about external behavior. It was tied to the Victorian belief in moral self-discipline. To behave with decorum was to demonstrate control over one's impulses, a virtue linked to both religious ideals and the emerging middle-class identity. Poor manners, conversely, were often interpreted as signs of moral weakness. Yet, the rigid framework of etiquette also created tensions. Social reformers and satirists of the era sometimes mocked the elaborate rules, arguing that they stifled genuine human connection. The novelist Anthony Trollope, for example, lampooned the obsession with propriety in his depictions of social climbers, while caricatures in Punch magazine poked fun at over-formalized greetings and absurdly polite small talk. Even so, most Victorians navigated these complexities with a mixture of caution and pride. Mastery of etiquette could open doors, sometimes literally, for a young man seeking advancement in business. A reputation for refined manners might secure an invitation to an influential family's home. For a young woman, it could mean an advantageous marriage. In this way, etiquette functioned as both a barrier and a bridge, separating classes yet offering the ambitious a way to ascend. And in the bustling streets of London, the genteel drawing rooms of Bath, or the industrial towns of the Midlands, it remained an unspoken language, one that every Victorian, whether reluctantly or eagerly, had to learn. The iron grip of etiquette extended beyond the domestic sphere into nearly every public and professional interaction. In Victorian Britain, business was conducted not merely through contracts and negotiations, but through the cultivation of trust. And trust was built on the foundation of perceived respectability. A shopkeeper's success could depend as much on his courteous bow to customers as on the quality of his goods. A solicitor's reputation hinged on his ability to maintain a calm, measured demeanor even in heated disputes. Railway travel, a relatively new phenomenon in the mid-19th century, brought its own set of unwritten rules. Gentlemen were expected to offer their seats to ladies, the elderly, or those of higher social rank, though this was sometimes awkward in crowded third-class carriages where distinctions blurred. Conversation with strangers was permissible but had to remain light and impersonal. No prying into backgrounds, incomes, or family matters. Even the simple act of smoking was governed by etiquette. A gentleman always asked permission before lighting his pipe or cigar in shared spaces, and many considered it poor form altogether in mixed company. Public entertainment, whether theater, concerts, or lectures, was another arena where decorum was tested. Arriving late to a performance was considered a serious breach, as it distracted both the audience and the performers. Applause was to be measured and well-timed, not the unrestrained cheering that would become common in later centuries. At the opera glasses served a dual function: to better view the stage and to discreetly observe fellow attendees without being caught staring. Church attendance was, for many Victorians, the ultimate weekly stage for propriety. Clothing had to be immaculate yet modest. Arriving early was preferable, as it allowed time for quiet reflection before the service began. Families often filed into pews in a carefully arranged order, elders first, followed by younger members, a subtle signal of both respect and hierarchy. Sermons were listened to in silence, and even small children were expected to remain still. Etiquette also governed correspondence. Letters were a lifeline in an era before instant communication, and their formality reflected the importance placed on written words. The choice of paper, the neatness of handwriting, and the precision of spelling all spoke volumes about the writer's character. Salutations and closings had to match the degree of intimacy. "My dear sir," for polite formality; "dearest," reserved for family or close friends. A blot of ink or a hasty scrawl could inadvertently insult the recipient. For the wealthy, social events such as balls and garden parties were governed by an even more intricate etiquette. Dance cards, small booklets worn on the wrist by women, recorded their scheduled partners for each dance, preventing the awkwardness of double promises. Men were expected to engage in light conversation during a dance, but never monopolize a partner for more than two in a row, lest it appear overly familiar. Departures from a party were handled with equal grace. A discreet word of thanks to the host was preferred over a prolonged, attention-drawing farewell. Travel abroad, increasingly popular among the upper classes during the Victorian era, demanded an awareness of foreign customs while still upholding one's British dignity. Guidebooks of the time, such as those by John Murray or Baedeker, often included sections advising travelers on how to avoid offending locals while maintaining proper English reserve. The ideal Victorian traveler was polite, observant, and adaptable, never loud, brash, or dismissive of unfamiliar traditions. Yet for all the seriousness with which etiquette was taken, it could also be a source of gentle amusement. Satirical works like Mrs. Humphrey's Manners for Men and Manners for Women offered earnest advice that, in hindsight, often reads as charmingly over-precise. For example, one rule stated that when walking with two ladies, a gentleman should position himself between them only if the pavement was narrow. Otherwise, he should allow them to walk side by side while he took the outer edge. Such details, while seemingly trivial, were imbued with symbolic meaning in the Victorian mind. a visible sign of courtesy and consideration. The late Victorian period, however, saw subtle shifts. The spread of literacy, the rise of mass media, and the gradual loosening of class boundaries all began to erode the rigid hierarchies of earlier decades. The burgeoning women's rights movement challenged some of the more restrictive aspects of etiquette, particularly those that confined women to passive roles in conversation and public life. Younger generations, exposed to new ideas through travel, education, and literature, began to favor sincerity over stiff formality. By the end of Queen Victoria's reign in 1901, the elaborate social codes that had once defined every interaction were already softening. Yet their influence lingered. Many modern conventions, such as holding doors open, sending thank you notes, and refraining from overly personal questions in casual conversation, can trace their lineage directly back to Victorian principles. Ultimately, Victorian etiquette was more than a set of arbitrary rules. It was a reflection of a society balancing tradition with rapid change, industrial progress with moral restraint, and individual ambition with communal respect. For its adherents, etiquette was a kind of invisible architecture supporting the grand edifice of social order, even if it sometimes felt like a gilded cage. And while modern life has largely abandoned the rigid bowing, curtsying, and endless formalities, the Victorian belief that courtesy and self-restraint are marks of good character still echoes faintly in our daily interactions. In that sense, the language of manners they spoke so fluently has never truly fallen silent. Victorian Britain was an age of contrasts. Immense wealth and grinding poverty, technological marvels and deep-seated social inequalities. While the middle and upper classes lived according to intricate codes of etiquette, the working classes faced a very different daily reality. For them, manners were often less about social refinement and more about survival. The Industrial Revolution had transformed Britain into the workshop of the world. Factories roared in cities like Manchester, Birmingham, and Glasgow, drawing thousands from rural villages in search of work. The resulting urban boom created overcrowded slums where sanitation was poor and disease rampant. In such environments, the niceties of Victorian high society could seem impossibly far away. Yet even here, unwritten rules governed behavior. Among neighbors, trust and mutual aid were essential. A family might share coal or bread with another in hard times, and gossip, while often sharp, was also a means of enforcing community standards. Workplace etiquette in industrial Britain was shaped by strict hierarchies. In textile mills, dockyards, and coal mines, workers were expected to show deference to supervisors, speaking only when addressed and following instructions without complaint. Punctuality was a mark of reliability, and lateness could mean instant dismissal. While unions gradually gained strength, giving workers more voice, early in the century the balance of power heavily favored employers. Even outside work hours, a laborer might avoid public drunkenness or disorderly conduct, not because of upper-class moralizing, but because a bad reputation could lead to being blacklisted from jobs. In the countryside, agricultural workers and tenant farmers lived by rhythms as old as the land itself. Though the Industrial Revolution was drawing many to the cities, rural communities maintained traditions that city dwellers might consider old-fashioned. Respect for elders was paramount, and hospitality, even among the poor, was a matter of pride. A visitor, no matter how unexpected, could expect to be offered tea or bread. Local festivals and church gatherings offered chances for socializing, courtship, and the exchange of news, with behavior tempered by the watchful eyes of neighbors. Religious observance played a key role in setting moral expectations across all classes. The Sunday service was both a spiritual duty and a social event, and a family's regular attendance signaled respectability. The message from the pulpit often reinforced prevailing norms: thrift, sobriety, hard work, and modesty. Even in the poorest districts, mothers might send children to Sunday school, hoping to give them at least some education and moral grounding. For women of the working class, daily life was a balancing act between home and wage labor. Many took in laundry, worked as seamstresses, or found employment in domestic service for wealthier families. The latter role came with its own strict etiquette. Servants were to be invisible yet ever attentive, addressing their employers with the utmost respect, never speaking unless spoken to, and maintaining a deferential posture. Evenings off were rare, and the line between personal freedom and professional duty could be thin. For men, especially in industrial towns, the local public house, or pub, was a cornerstone of social life. Here, camaraderie was built over pints of ale, darts games, and shared songs. Yet even pub culture had rules. Buying a round of drinks for one's companions was an unspoken obligation, and failing to reciprocate could mark a man as stingy. Arguments might flare, but outright brawling was discouraged, at least in respectable establishments. Education was a dividing line. For the wealthy, it was a polished tool for advancement. For the poor, it was often a privilege snatched in brief moments between labor. The 1870 Elementary Education Act, which made schooling more widely available, began to narrow the gap. But the etiquette of the classroom itself, raising one's hand, standing when addressed, speaking politely to the teacher, was part of the broader Victorian project of instilling discipline and order in the next generation. Interestingly, the influence of high society's manners filtered downward over time. Cheap publications, serialized in newspapers or sold as penny pamphlets, offered guides to polite behavior aimed at working people who aspired to rise in status. Advice ranged from how to introduce oneself properly to the correct way to hold a knife and fork. Though many of these tips were impractical for those struggling to afford even the next meal, the aspiration itself reflected the Victorian belief that self-improvement was both possible and desirable. Charity work brought the classes into contact, often awkwardly. Wealthy philanthropists visited slums to distribute food, clothing, or religious tracts, expecting gratitude in return. Yet the working poor were not always receptive to lectures on morality from those who had never known hunger. The etiquette of giving and receiving charity could be fraught. Recipients sought to preserve dignity, while donors tried to balance generosity with a desire to maintain social distance. For the upwardly mobile, small shopkeepers, skilled craftsmen, clerks, navigating between working-class roots and middle-class aspirations required careful attention to manners. Hosting a tea with proper china, dressing neatly for church, and teaching children to say, please, and thank you, were not just niceties. They were strategies for signaling respectability to peers and potential patrons alike. In this way, Victorian etiquette was not solely the province of drawing rooms and ballrooms. It was a shared cultural language, spoken differently by each class but understood across society. Whether in the form of elaborate dining rituals or the simple courtesy of holding a door, these manners help define one's place in the social order, and, perhaps more importantly, offered a ladder for those who hope to climb higher. By the mid to late 19th century, Britain was experiencing a moral transformation. The stern, duty-bound ethos of early Victorian society began to soften under the influence of new ideas, social reforms, and the sheer pace of change brought by industrial and imperial expansion. Etiquette, while still valued, evolved alongside these shifts, reflecting the tensions between tradition and progress. One of the most notable changes was the growing emphasis on respectability as a means of social mobility. For the burgeoning middle class, bank clerks, school teachers, small business owners, manners were no longer just a sign of breeding. They were a ticket to advancement. Mastering the right handshake, addressing letters with correct titles, and knowing the subtleties of dining etiquette could open doors to better business opportunities and social circles. Books like The Habits of Good Society, 1859, sold briskly, offering advice to those eager to fit in with polite company. Women, in particular, were caught in a complex web of expectations. While early Victorian ideals placed them firmly in the domestic sphere, the latter part of the century saw new opportunities, though still limited, emerging. The rise of women's colleges, increased participation in charitable organizations, and movements advocating for women's suffrage brought more women into public life. Yet this expansion came with strict behavioral guidelines. Public speeches were to be delivered in a calm, measured tone. Dress had to remain modest, and assertiveness had to be tempered with grace to avoid accusations of unladylike conduct. Courtship rituals also began to shift subtly. The rigid chaperone system persisted, especially among the upper classes, but urban life offered more opportunities for unplanned encounters in shops, at railway stations, or in public parks. Young people could exchange glances or brief words outside of parental supervision, though propriety demanded these interactions remain innocent. Even so, etiquette manuals warned of the dangers of being too forward or too familiar, particularly for women, whose reputations were fragile and easily tarnished. The late Victorian years also witnessed the rise of a more pronounced public manners culture. The growth of railways, omnibuses, and trams brought strangers into close proximity, requiring new rules of behavior. Men were advised to offer their seats to women and the elderly, refrain from smoking in enclosed spaces, and keep conversations low so as not to disturb others. Newspapers occasionally published humorous or exasperated letters from readers complaining about breaches of etiquette, such as men spitting tobacco juice on train floors or women placing parcels on seats during busy hours. Empire played a role in shaping late-century manners, too. As Britain's global reach extended, colonial officials and travelers brought back stories, artifacts, and even servants from far-off lands. Hosting an Indian-themed dinner or displaying Chinese porcelain in the drawing room became fashionable among the elite. Yet these cultural borrowings were often filtered through a lens of superiority, with etiquette reinforcing a belief in Britain's civilizing mission. Guests at such events were expected to display curiosity, but not, heaven forbid, to question imperial policy too loudly. Meanwhile, The temperance movement gained momentum, reshaping social customs around alcohol. Advocates, many of them women from the middle class, argued that sobriety was essential to moral improvement and family stability. Dry gatherings, tea meetings, musical evenings, and literary discussions became alternative social outlets. For those in the movement, refusing a drink was not rudeness but a point of moral pride. Yet in working-class districts, where the pub remained a central institution, temperance was sometimes seen as an outsider's imposition, leading to quiet resistance. The theater, too, became a space where etiquette was hotly debated. Earlier in the century, audiences had been rowdy, shouting at actors, throwing objects on stage, and freely eating and drinking during performances. By the 1880s, however, the theater was being refined into a more genteel experience. Playbills and newspapers reminded patrons to arrive on time, refrain from talking during scenes, and dress appropriately for evening performances. Attending the theater thus became not only entertainment but a demonstration of one's cultivation. In private homes, the dinner party remained a central pillar of social life, but the format evolved. By the end of the century, multi-course meals with matched silverware and crystal glasses were common among the upper and aspiring middle classes. Hosts were expected to seat guests strategically, placing talkative personalities between quieter ones, separating potential political opponents, and ensuring that no woman was left without a male conversational partner. The art of small talk was highly prized, with topics carefully chosen to avoid offense. Literature, travel, the weather, and current exhibitions were safe. Politics, religion, and money were not. Interestingly, the very rigidity of these social codes spurred a countercurrent of satire and rebellion. Comic operas by Gilbert and Sullivan poked fun at pompous manners and inflated self-importance. Writers like Oscar Wilde used wit to expose the hypocrisy behind polished politeness. His plays, The Importance of Being Earnest chief among them, revealed how etiquette could mask selfish motives and absurd pretensions. For the young and the unconventional, this mockery offered a sly form of resistance to a society obsessed with appearances. By the close of the Victorian era in 1901, etiquette was both more widespread and more contested than at the century's start. Industrialization, urbanization, empire, and reform movements had pulled millions into closer contact, making shared rules of conduct more important than ever. Yet the very forces that strengthened these codes also sowed the seeds of their transformation. The Edwardian period that followed would inherit much of this etiquette but begin to loosen it, allowing for greater individual expression and a more relaxed social atmosphere. In essence, late Victorian etiquette was a balancing act between old hierarchies and new opportunities, between public morality and private desires, between the desire to belong and the urge to stand apart. It was a language everyone was expected to speak, but one that each class, gender, and generation spoke with its own accent. If the drawing rooms of the wealthy represented the polished facade of Victorian Britain, the slums were its hidden foundation, dark, overcrowded, and dangerously fragile. While the upper classes dined by candlelight and the middle classes strolled along neatly paved promenades, millions of the urban poor lived in conditions that shocked even their contemporaries. The Industrial Revolution had drawn waves of workers into cities like London, Manchester, Birmingham, and Liverpool, but the rapid pace of growth far outstripped the capacity to house them decently. The poorest neighborhoods, often referred to as rookeries, courts, or alleys, were mazes of narrow streets, crumbling buildings, and open drains. In London, districts like Whitechapel, St. Giles, and Southwark became notorious for their squalor. A single dilapidated house might be divided into 10 or more tiny rooms, each home to a different family. In the worst cases, multiple families shared a single room, with little more than a blanket or curtain to divide their sleeping spaces. Privacy was non-existent, and so was sanitation. Human waste was emptied into cesspools or open gutters, contaminating the water supply and fueling deadly outbreaks of cholera and typhus. The stench of the slums was a constant companion. Open sewers ran alongside dwellings, and heaps of rotting refuse attracted rats and clouds of flies. The air was thick with smoke from coal fires and the acrid smell of tanning, brewing, or other small-scale industries that operated right beside people's homes. In summer, the heat intensified the foul odors. In winter, damp and cold seeped through every wall. For the working poor, daily life was a struggle for survival. Many men found employment in casual labor, loading ships at the docks, hauling goods in warehouses, or working on building sites. Wages were unpredictable. A day without work meant a day without food. Women often contributed to the family income by taking in laundry, sewing, or selling goods in the street. Some worked in sweatshops, enduring exhausting hours in poorly ventilated rooms for pennies a day. Children, too, were part of the labor force. Boys might run errands, shine shoes, or work as crossing sweepers to keep the streets clear for wealthier pedestrians. Girls were sent into domestic service or put to work in factories and workshops. The lack of secure work meant that many families lived in constant debt to slum landlords and local shopkeepers. Rent was collected weekly and in cash. Those who could not pay were evicted without hesitation. The poorest often ended up in lodging houses, crowded dormitories where dozens of people might share one large room, sleeping on wooden benches or even sitting upright in penny seats through the night. Alcohol, particularly gin, became both a solace and a scourge in the slums. For those worn down by exhaustion and despair, drink offered temporary relief from hunger and misery. But excessive drinking drained already meager incomes and contributed to family breakdown, violence, and ill health. Reformers like temperance campaigners saw gin as a root cause of poverty. Others argued it was merely a symptom of a deeper social malaise. Crime was both a consequence of poverty and a means of survival. Pickpocketing, burglary, and petty theft were common, especially among children who had little chance of finding honest work. Gangs controlled certain neighborhoods, and police often avoided venturing into the most dangerous alleys without backup. At the same time, many slum dwellers developed intricate networks of mutual support, sharing food, caring for sick neighbors, and pooling money for funerals. Life in the rookeries could be brutal, but it was not without bonds of loyalty and community. Disease was an ever-present threat. Cholera epidemics swept through London in 1832, 1848, 1854, and 1866, killing thousands in a matter of weeks. Tuberculosis, scarlet fever, and diphtheria claimed countless more lives, especially among children. Medical care was scarce and often unaffordable. Charitable hospitals existed, but they were overwhelmed. The publication of Edwin Chadwick's 1842 report on the sanitary condition of the laboring population shocked the public with its detailed accounts of filth and overcrowding, helping to spur the public health acts later in the century. Philanthropists and social reformers sought to address the problem in various ways. Some, like Octavia Hill, pioneered improved housing schemes that replaced slum tenements with clean, well-ventilated buildings, though these were often still beyond the means of the very poorest. Others, like the Salvation Army, offered food, shelter, and religious guidance to those in need. Yet charity could be tinged with moral judgment. Assistance was often conditional on sobriety, church attendance, or proof of deserving status. For all the grim realities, slum life was not solely defined by misery. Street markets bustled with energy, selling everything from second-hand clothes to hot pies. Music halls offered cheap entertainment, where audiences roared with laughter at comic songs and sketches. Public houses served as social hubs where news, gossip, and opportunities for work circulated alongside pints of beer. Religious missions brought hymns, Sunday schools, and occasional outings to the countryside for city children who had never seen open fields. Still, the contrast between rich and poor was stark and unavoidable. A short carriage ride could carry a wealthy Londoner from the gaslit elegance of Mayfair to the muddy, rat-infested alleys of the East End. Social commentators worried about the moral and political dangers of such inequality, fearing that unrest might erupt if conditions did not improve. By the century's end, debates about housing reform, public sanitation, and labor rights were shaping the political agenda in ways that would influence the 20th century. In the end, Victorian society was held together by a complex web of dependence and division. The working poor built the roads, loaded the ships, sewed the garments, and scrubbed the floors that kept the economy moving. They were essential, yet they lived in worlds far removed from the genteel salons and manicured gardens of their social superiors. The slums were a reminder that beneath the era's self-congratulatory talk of progress and civilization lay a harder truth. That prosperity for some rested on the toil and hardship of many. When people today imagine Victorian food, they might picture lavish dinner tables piled high with roasted meats, silver platters, and delicate desserts under glittering chandeliers. And yes, if you were wealthy enough to live in Belgravia or Mayfair, that vision wasn't far from the truth. But for the vast majority of people in 19th century Britain, Victorian food looked very different, more like a bowl of watery gruel, a hunk of stale bread, and maybe, if you were lucky, a scrap of bacon on Sundays. The Victorian diet was shaped not only by class but by geography, industrialization, and moral attitudes toward food itself. The working class table in the overcrowded neighborhoods of London's East End, Liverpool's Docklands, or the smoky mill towns of Lancashire, working class families survived on diets that were cheap, filling, and above all, repetitive. Bread was the cornerstone of most meals, often accompanied by butter if the family could afford it, or by dripping, rendered animal fat, if they could not. Tea, heavily sweetened with sugar, was the other staple, a cheap stimulant that helped fight fatigue during long shifts in the factory. Protein, in the form of meat, was rare. Many Victorian workers went days without tasting fresh meat. Instead, they relied on salted pork, tinned corned beef, or even cheaper options like block pudding, a type of blood pudding. Vegetables were eaten, but only in modest amounts, and usually boiled beyond recognition to make them easier to digest and to ensure they were free of parasites. Potatoes, carrots, and cabbage appeared most often, forming the base of simple stews. Street food also played a huge role in feeding the urban poor. Vendors sold hot pies filled with questionable cuts of meat, bowls of pea soup, slices of bread spread with margarine, and baked potatoes cooked in portable ovens. In poorer districts, you could find stalls selling whelks, cockles, and eels, cheap seafood that could be boiled or jellied to last longer. A penny could buy you a filling snack, though hygiene was often non-existent. Middle-class dining habits, the Victorian middle class, clerks, shopkeepers, teachers, sat somewhere between the two extremes. They could afford more variety in their diets, but were also influenced by prevailing ideas about respectability and moral discipline. Breakfast might include eggs, bacon, and toast, along with tea or coffee. Lunch could be a meat pie or cold roast leftovers from the night before. Dinner, the main meal, was more elaborate, often featuring roast beef, mutton, or poultry, accompanied by multiple vegetable dishes and followed by a pudding or tart. Middle-class Victorians were also more likely to eat fresh fruit, though tropical imports like bananas and pineapples were considered exotic luxuries. Preserves and jams were common, as was home baking. Cookbooks like Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management offered detailed instructions on how to prepare wholesome, respectable meals, reinforcing the idea that the way a family ate reflected their moral character. The aristocratic feast at the top of the social ladder, the wealthy enjoyed meals that were both a sensory and social experience. Dinner parties could last hours, with multiple courses served in a strict order: soup, fish, entree, roast, game, dessert, and finally, fruits and cheeses. Wines were carefully paired with each course, and conversation was as important as the food itself. The upper classes could afford imported delicacies such as oysters, truffles, and champagne. For the rich, dining wasn't just about sustenance, it was a performance of status. The tableware, the floral arrangements, the number of servants, and even the seating plan were carefully curated to impress guests. Many dishes were designed to showcase skill and extravagance: elaborate molded jellies, towering pastry constructions, and intricately decorated cakes. Moral and religious influences. Victorian attitudes toward food were also shaped by moral and religious movements. The temperance movement, which sought to reduce alcohol consumption, promoted alternatives like tea, cocoa, and mineral water. Evangelical and reformist groups argued that plain, simple food encouraged moral purity, while rich, spicy, or indulgent dishes were seen as corrupting influences. Vegetarianism, though rare, began to gain traction during the Victorian period, often for moral reasons linked to animal welfare and Christian ethics. The Vegetarian Society was founded in 1847, promoting diets based on grains, vegetables, and dairy products. The role of Empire Britain's vast empire brought new foods to Victorian tables. Tea from India and Ceylon, sugar from the Caribbean, spices from Asia, and rice from Burma all became part of the national diet. These imports transformed both upper and middle class cooking, though the working classes often consumed them in simpler forms: sweetened tea, curry powder mixed into stews, or rice pudding made with imported rice. Food and health, unfortunately. The Victorian diet, especially for the poor, was often deficient in essential nutrients. Rickets, caused by vitamin D deficiency, scurvy, vitamin C deficiency, and anemia were common. The heavy reliance on bread and tea meant that many people were chronically undernourished, even if they felt full. The lack of refrigeration also meant that food spoilage was a constant risk. Milk could sour within hours, meat could rot quickly in warm weather, and seafood could become dangerous to eat unless cooked immediately. This is one reason why pickling, salting, and smoking were so important in Victorian food preservation. The comfort of puddings. One enduring feature of Victorian cuisine was the pudding. Whether boiled, steamed, or baked, puddings were the ultimate comfort food. Dense, filling, and endlessly adaptable. For the poor, suet pudding made with flour, fat, and dried fruit could be cooked in a cloth and feed an entire family. For the wealthy, elaborate sponge puddings with custard or brandy sauce offered a sweet ending to a lavish meal. A divided table. The Victorian dinner table was a reflection of Britain itself, deeply divided by class, wealth, and opportunity. While the rich dined on delicacies from across the empire, the poor relied on bread, tea, and the occasional stew to keep hunger at bay. Yet across all classes, food was more than just fuel. It was tied to identity, morality, and the rhythms of daily life. Life in the rural towns and emerging industrial suburbs of Victorian Britain offered a strikingly different perspective from the grandeur of the urban elite. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing, and with it came a dramatic transformation of work, leisure, and the rhythms of daily existence. While factories and mills sprang up across the landscape, reshaping both skylines and livelihoods, the human cost of this rapid progress was felt most sharply by those whose hands and backs powered the machinery. In the factory towns, the day began before sunrise. Workers would rise in the dim half-light, dressing quickly in their plainest clothes, garments they would not mind ruining with soot or grease. The streets were often eerily quiet in the early hours, broken only by the shuffle of boots on cobblestones and the distant clatter of machinery warming up. A factory shift could last 12 to 14 hours, sometimes longer during peak production. It was not uncommon for a single household to send every member, including children as young as 8, to work in the mill or mine. These children, often referred to as half-timers, when they split their days between work and a meager education, shouldered responsibilities far beyond their years. A boy might spend his day hauling coal carts through narrow mine tunnels, his small frame making him better suited to the cramped spaces. A girl might stand for hours at a loom, deftly guiding threads with aching fingers under the constant roar of machinery. Safety measures were minimal, and accidents, sometimes fatal, were a grim fact of life. One slip of a hand near a moving gear, or a moment's distraction when handling boiling vats of dye, could result in lasting injury. Yet, for all the hardships, there was a resilience in these communities. Neighbor looked out for neighbor, and even the most exhausted workers found moments to share news, sing songs, or tend a small garden patch after their shift. Sunday was often the only day of true rest, and for many families, church was both a spiritual refuge and a social gathering place. There, workers could exchange news, form friendships, and perhaps forget, if only briefly, the grind of the week. The expansion of the railway network brought new influences to these factory towns. Goods, ideas, and people traveled more quickly, linking isolated communities to larger markets. While some feared that big city morals would erode traditional values, others embraced the opportunities that came with greater connectivity. For the first time, a working-class family might afford a brief seaside holiday, traveling to newly popular resorts like Blackpool or Brighton. Even a single day at the shore, feeling the salt breeze and hearing the crash of waves, was a treasured escape from the soot-stained streets of home. Meanwhile, the countryside remained a world of its own. Agricultural laborers still rose with the sun, their work tied to the seasons rather than to factory bells. In spring, they sowed grain and vegetables. In summer, they tended crops and livestock. In autumn, they brought in the harvest. And in winter, they mended tools and cared for animals through the cold. The introduction of new machinery, such as the mechanical reaper, began to change farming practices, reducing the demand for manual labor in some areas. This shift pushed many rural workers toward the cities in search of employment, swelling the ranks of the urban poor. Despite the hardships, rural life carried a certain rhythm and closeness to nature that factory towns could not replicate. Villages held annual fairs, harvest festivals, and market days where goods, livestock, and gossip were all exchanged with equal enthusiasm. Local customs, from maypole dances to village cricket matches, provided both entertainment and a sense of shared identity. Housing in these communities varied widely. In rural villages, cottages were often small and cramped, with thatched or slate roofs and walls of stone or timber. In industrial towns, rows of brick terraced houses sprang up to accommodate workers, often built quickly and cheaply by factory owners. These homes lacked indoor plumbing, relying instead on shared outdoor pumps and communal privies. Privacy was scarce, and illnesses could spread rapidly in such close quarters. The Victorian era also saw the gradual rise of reform movements seeking to improve conditions for workers. Campaigns for shorter working hours, the regulation of child labor, and improved safety standards gained momentum, spurred on by journalists, philanthropists, and occasionally enlightened industrialists. These efforts were slow to bear fruit, but they planted the seeds for later labor protections. It is tempting to see the working-class Victorian experience solely through the lens of hardship, but that would miss the full picture. For every tale of grueling labor, there were stories of personal triumph, of men and women who taught themselves to read by candlelight, who saved penny by penny to buy a second-hand sewing machine, who formed choirs, football clubs, and friendly societies to support one another. The era was a complex tapestry of endurance, adaptation, and hope. By the late 19th century, industrial and rural life had become deeply intertwined. Goods from the countryside fed the cities, while urban industries supplied tools, textiles, and other manufactured goods back to rural markets. Railways linked them together, shrinking distances and fostering a shared national identity, even as class divisions remained sharp. For the millions who lived outside the sphere of wealth and privilege, the Victorian world was one of constant negotiation. between old traditions and new technologies, between community bonds and the demands of industrial discipline, between the grind of necessity and the small joys that made life worth living. It was in these ordinary lives, perhaps even more than in the glittering halls of the elite, that the true story of Victorian Britain unfolded. If the countryside and factory towns revealed the daily grind of Victorian Britain, it was in the rising middle class that the era's most striking social changes became visible. These were the shopkeepers, clerks, school teachers, skilled craftsmen, and small business owners who stood between the working poor and the landed or industrial elite. For them, the Victorian period offered a rare chance to climb the social ladder if they could master the era's rigid codes of respectability. Middle-class life revolved around the home, which was not merely a place to eat and sleep, but a carefully curated symbol of moral character. A well-kept parlor, complete with polished furniture, lace curtains, and perhaps a piano in the corner, told visitors that the family was respectable, disciplined, and deserving of their place in society. The presence of books, even if they were more decorative than read, signaled education and refinement. For many families, saving enough to hire a live-in maid of all work was both a convenience and a badge of success, proof that the household had risen above the struggles of manual labor. Education became a key stepping stone for middle-class aspirations. While working-class children might leave school early to contribute to the family income, middle-class boys could attend grammar schools and, in some cases, universities. Girls were often educated at home or at private academies where the curriculum emphasized music, drawing, French, and the social graces expected of a future wife and hostess. For ambitious families, investing in education was a way to secure both economic stability and social advancement. The workplace for middle-class men was increasingly the office rather than the factory floor. Clerks in waistcoats and stiff collars filled ledgers in banking houses, shipping firms, and government departments. Shopkeepers prided themselves on well-stocked shelves and polite service, while professionals, doctors, lawyers, architects, built reputations on skill and trustworthiness. The expansion of the railways and postal system also created new roles, from telegraph operators to traveling salesmen, reflecting the era's growing emphasis on speed, communication, and national integration. Middle-class women, however, were largely confined to the domestic sphere. The separate spheres ideology of the time held that men belonged in the public world of work and politics, while women were the moral guardians of the home. This did not mean their lives were idle. Far from it. Managing a household required budgeting, overseeing servants, arranging meals, sewing clothing, and ensuring children were properly schooled and well-mannered. In addition, women were expected to participate in charitable work, such as organizing church bazaars or visiting the poor, which reinforced their image as nurturing and virtuous. Social life for the middle class blended aspiration with caution. Tea parties, dinner gatherings, and attendance at lectures or concerts allowed families to demonstrate their refinement and make useful connections. But such occasions were governed by a labyrinth of etiquette rules. The correct hour to call on a neighbor, the proper way to introduce guests, the topics acceptable for polite conversation. A single breach of decorum, a too familiar tone, a poorly chosen joke could damage a family's standing. Travel, once the privilege of the wealthy, began to filter down to the middle class as well. Excursions to the seaside, trips to stately homes, and even journeys to the continent became possible for those with modest savings. The Great Exhibition of 1851, held in London's Crystal Palace, was a landmark moment, drawing visitors from across the country to marvel at technological wonders, fine art, and cultural displays from around the world. For many middle-class families, it was both a thrilling experience and a reminder of Britain's growing global influence. Religion played a central role in middle-class identity. Regular church attendance was expected, and families often took pride in supporting missionary societies or contributing to the construction of new chapels. The nonconformist tradition, Methodists, Baptists, Congregationalists, flourished alongside the Church of England, offering communities where middle-class values of hard work, thrift, and moral discipline were reinforced. Sermons often stressed the virtues of self-reliance and charity, shaping how people viewed both personal success and their obligations to the less fortunate. For all their stability, middle-class families were not immune to anxiety. Economic downturns could devastate small businesses, while illness could quickly erode savings. Maintaining appearances was vital. A family might quietly endure hardship rather than let neighbors see their decline. The pressure to keep up with one's social circle could lead to careful budgeting, discreet second-hand purchases, and, in some cases, mounting debts hidden behind a polished front door. By the late 19th century, the lines between the middle and working classes began to blur in certain areas. Skilled workers with steady incomes could afford some of the comforts once reserved for their social betters, while ambitious middle-class entrepreneurs could find themselves welcomed into elite circles. This fluidity, though limited, was a hallmark of Victorian society's gradual transformation, a shift from rigid birth-based hierarchies toward a system where education, occupation, and manners could, at least in theory, redefine one's place. The middle class played a critical role in shaping the cultural and political landscape of Victorian Britain. They championed causes such as temperance, public sanitation, and the expansion of education. They subscribed to popular magazines, joined literary societies, and attended public lectures, feeding a growing appetite for self-improvement and civic engagement. Many reform movements drew their strength from middle-class organizers who believed that moral and social progress were as important as economic growth. In the great sweep of Victorian life, the middle class was both a beneficiary and a driver of change. Their ambitions fueled the expansion of commerce and education. Their values influenced laws and public policy, and their taste shaped the era's art, architecture, and literature. They were also, perhaps, the most conscious of the balancing act between tradition and modernity, eager to embrace the opportunities of an industrial and imperial age, yet determined to preserve the moral codes they believed gave society its stability. When viewed alongside the rural laborer and the factory hand, the middle-class Victorian might seem sheltered from the harshest realities of the age. Yet their story reveals the aspirations, anxieties, and everyday negotiations that defined an era of unprecedented transformation. In their parlors, offices, and chapels, the middle class forged a vision of respectability that would echo well into the 20th century, one that still shapes our notions of success, propriety, and progress today. If one were to picture the Victorian home purely through the rose-tinted lens of period dramas, they might imagine spotless drawing rooms, immaculately laid tea tables, and families dressed in perfectly pressed clothes. But peel back the layers of cinematographic polish, and the reality of domestic hygiene in the 19th century is far more complicated and, at times, rather pungent. For the wealthier classes, the home was a stage upon which social respectability was displayed, and this meant constant attention to the visible cleanliness of rooms that guests might see. Parlors, dining rooms, and entry halls were scrubbed, dusted, and polished daily by a small army of servants. Floors were swept, rugs beaten within an inch of their life, and every piece of silver was kept gleaming. But this obsessive attention to appearances rarely extended to the less visible parts of the house. Bedrooms might go weeks without a thorough cleaning. Kitchens were breeding grounds for bacteria long before anyone knew the word, and servant quarters were cramped, musty, and largely ignored. For working-class homes, the story was even grimmer. Space was limited, ventilation poor, and resources for cleaning scarce. A single bucket of water might have to serve for cooking, washing, and a bit of personal cleaning before being thrown out into the street. Coal dust from heating stoves settled on every surface, mingling with soot from nearby chimneys and the ever-present grime from the streets outside. Housewives often spent hours scrubbing floors or laundering clothes in cold water, only for them to be soiled again within a day. Laundering, in fact, was one of the most physically punishing domestic chores. Without indoor plumbing, water had to be fetched from pumps or wells, boiled over an open fire, and poured into large tubs. Clothing was scrubbed with soap made from animal fat and lye, effective but caustic, before being wrung out and hung to dry in whatever space was available. Winter months made this task miserable. Clothing would freeze stiff on the line, and the damp smell would linger indoors when laundry had to be dried inside. In wealthier households, the weekly laundry day often turned the basement into a steamy, sweat-filled sauna, where laundresses worked in punishing heat, inhaling fumes from boiling lye and starch. Another major hygiene battleground was the kitchen, and here Victorian domestic life reveals some of its darkest corners. Without refrigeration, food spoilage was a constant threat. Meat was salted, smoked, or stored in cool pantries. But in summer months, even the best methods could fail. Bread quickly went stale, milk soured within hours, and vegetables could rot before they reached the table. Flies and vermin were ever present. Traps, poison, and sheer vigilance were the only defenses. It's no wonder that stomach ailments, food poisoning, and intestinal parasites were common. For the working poor, kitchens often doubled as living spaces. A single fire served for both heating and cooking, and space constraints meant that beds, clothing, and food preparation areas coexisted in the same few square meters. In such cramped quarters, the line between clean and dirty blurred, not for lack of effort, but because of the sheer impossibility of keeping out the ever-present filth of the city. And then there were the smells. Even the wealthiest homes could not fully escape them. Coal smoke from fires, the sour scent of chamber pots before they were emptied, damp plaster walls that never fully dried in winter, all combined into an aroma that was simply the smell of home in the Victorian era. Candles scented with beeswax, dried lavender, and potpourri bowls were deployed to mask these odors, but their effects were temporary at best. In poorer homes, Where such luxuries were absent, the sense of cooking, unwashed clothing, and street filth became inescapable. Water supply itself posed another challenge. In wealthier neighborhoods, homes might have a connection to a municipal water line, but this water was often drawn from rivers or reservoirs contaminated with industrial waste and human sewage. Boiling helped, but not everyone took the time or had the fuel to do so. For the poor, water had to be carried in buckets from pumps or public fountains, a chore often assigned to children, and rationed carefully throughout the day. When cholera or typhoid broke out, water sources were usually the culprit. Yet understanding of waterborne disease was slow to develop. In both wealthy and poor households, cleaning often meant moving dirt around rather than removing it. Carpets were beaten outdoors but never washed, and heavy draperies were rarely cleaned at all. Feather dusters did little more than redistribute dust into the air, where it would settle again within hours. The Victorian love for clutter, ornate furniture, intricate decorations, and endless trinkets made thorough cleaning almost impossible. Every surface was a potential dust trap, and every object required careful handling to avoid damage. Interestingly, despite these shortcomings, many Victorians believed they were living in an age of unprecedented cleanliness. Advances in household goods, from soap manufacturing to mechanical carpet sweepers, were marketed as signs of progress, and magazines were filled with advice on maintaining a proper home. Yet the focus remained on visible order rather than microbial safety, which was poorly understood until the later decades of the century. By the 1890s, however, the rise of germ theory began to influence domestic habits. Middle-class women's magazines encouraged boiling dishcloths, airing out rooms, and washing hands more frequently, although the advice was often mixed with outdated notions, like keeping windows shut to avoid bad air. Even then, many of these practices were slow to reach working-class households, where time, money, and space remained constant obstacles to domestic hygiene. In short, the Victorian home, whether a grand townhouse or a cramped tenement, was a constant battlefield between the desire for cleanliness and the realities of the era. Dirt, disease, and odor were formidable foes, and while the Victorians fought them with determination, they fought without the full arsenal of modern sanitation. What they achieved was often remarkable given their limitations, but the standards of clean were defined less by the absence of germs and more by the maintenance of appearances. As the turn of the 20th century approached, subtle but significant changes began to ripple through Victorian society, changes that would soon redefine everyday hygiene. These shifts were not the result of any one invention or law, but rather a confluence of technological, medical, and cultural developments. The era's hallmark was its ability to blend innovation with deeply entrenched tradition, often producing an odd patchwork of progress and stubborn old habits. Public health campaigns began targeting not just the city's infrastructure but also its people. Posters encouraging regular hand washing appeared in schools, factories, and railway stations. The advice was simple: wash before meals, after using the toilet, and whenever visibly dirty. While these messages seem obvious today, for many Victorians, they represented a cultural shift. Hygiene was no longer just a matter of personal pride but a civic duty. This notion that cleanliness could protect not just oneself but also the community at large was relatively new and helped pave the way for the public health movements of the 20th century. Soap manufacturers seized this opportunity. Advertisements grew increasingly sophisticated, blending appeals to health with a strong undercurrent of morality. Cleanliness was framed as a reflection of one's character. A clean body implied a clean mind and moral fortitude. These ads often targeted women, suggesting that a wife's role was not only to maintain her own appearance but also to ensure the health and hygiene of her husband and children. The tone could be both persuasive and scolding, implying that any lapse in cleanliness was a lapse in virtue. Meanwhile, advances in home plumbing began to make a difference for the middle and upper classes. The installation of indoor water closets, once a rare luxury, became more common, especially in newly built townhouses. These early toilets, often connected to rudimentary sewage systems, were not perfect, but they dramatically reduced the presence of chamber pots in living spaces. For those who could afford it, this was a revolution in both convenience and sanitation. In working-class districts, however, such amenities were slower to arrive. Many families still relied on shared outdoor privies, with water supplied by communal pumps. In these areas, hygiene improvements often depended on community cooperation. Neighbors might pool resources to hire a night soil man to empty cesspits more regularly, or they might collectively petition local authorities for street cleaning and better drainage. While the results varied, such grassroots efforts showed that even without wealth, there was a growing awareness of and demand for better hygiene. Interestingly, as germ theory took root, the market for personal grooming items exploded. Nail brushes, tooth powders, and even early forms of deodorant became available. The Victorian toothbrush, typically made with a bone handle and boar bristles, became a household staple among the middle classes. Tooth powders, often containing chalk or crushed seashells, were sold in small tins with instructions to use them at least once a day. Dentists, who were becoming more common and better trained, urged their patients to adopt these habits, linking oral hygiene to overall health. Bathing habits also evolved. The proliferation of public bathhouses in industrial cities provided affordable access to hot water and soap for working families. These facilities often had two sections, a swimming area for recreation and exercise, and a series of private or semi-private bath cubicles where patrons could scrub thoroughly. The experience was not just about getting clean. It was also a social outing, a chance to interact with neighbors and enjoy a bit of comfort otherwise unavailable at home. Yet, in true Victorian fashion, even bathing could be tangled up in moral instruction. Pamphlets distributed at public baths warned against idleness and encouraged patrons to use their improved hygiene as a springboard to moral and professional improvement. Cleanliness was cast as both a physical necessity and a pathway to upward mobility. Another unexpected driver of hygiene improvement was the military. The British Army, having suffered terrible losses from disease in past conflicts, began enforcing stricter cleanliness standards for soldiers. These standards, regular bathing, proper disposal of waste, and attention to uniform maintenance, sometimes filtered back into civilian life when veterans returned home and brought these habits with them. By the end of the Victorian era, the cultural landscape of hygiene had been transformed. While inequality persisted, with the poor still struggling for the basics that the wealthy took for granted, the groundwork for modern hygiene practices had been firmly laid. Indoor plumbing, germ theory, mass-produced soap, and public health education had all converged to create a new expectation that cleanliness was not optional but essential for a healthy, respectable life. It was a transformation that future generations would take further, but it also marked the beginning of the end for many old Victorian practices. The era of vinegar foot baths, hair pomades made from lard, and once-a-month hair washing was fading, replaced by a culture that increasingly prized daily, or at least regular, attention to personal cleanliness. The Victorian love of moralizing about hygiene would remain, but it would soon be wrapped in the language of science and efficiency rather than tradition and propriety. By the final decades of the Victorian age, personal hygiene was no longer an occasional act of refreshment or an upper-class affectation. It had become a marker of modernity itself. To be unclean was not only to risk illness, but to risk being seen as backward, careless, or morally suspect. This powerful blend of science, social pressure, and marketing created a self-reinforcing cycle. As more people adopted better hygiene, the expectation for cleanliness rose, which in turn spurred further adoption. One of the most striking changes was in the domestic space. For wealthier households, bathrooms evolved from improvised wash areas to dedicated rooms with purpose-built fixtures. Early clawfoot tubs became symbols of comfort and refinement, often positioned near windows to allow in natural light and decorated with patterned tiles or polished brass taps. The wealthiest families might even have hot and cold running water, a true luxury at the time, supplied by increasingly reliable municipal systems. Servants were still responsible for heating and carrying water for baths in less advanced homes. But even here, the frequency of bathing was increasing. For the middle classes, the bathroom's evolution was slower but still steady. Portable tin or copper bathtubs remained in use, but more homes were built with small rooms specifically for washing, reflecting the growing belief that cleanliness deserved a dedicated space in the home. Advertisements for hygienic home improvements urged families to install enamel-lined bathtubs, porcelain basins, and even early flushing toilets. Investments that promised not just comfort, but also social prestige. Working-class hygiene improvements remained more dependent on communal resources. In many industrial towns, municipal bathhouses became civic pride projects. Local authorities boasted about their new facilities in newspapers, describing the latest plumbing systems, steam-heated water, and affordable ticket prices. These bathhouses weren't simply about cleanliness. They were designed to embody civic virtue, a statement that the town cared for its people's welfare. The architecture of some of these buildings was even ornate, with decorative brickwork, arched entrances, and domed roofs, signaling that bathing was no longer a shameful necessity but an act worthy of public celebration. Victorian public health reformers increasingly understood that good hygiene had to be paired with clean surroundings. This led to more organized street cleaning, regular garbage collection, and campaigns to reduce foul smells. The miasma theory, the belief that bad smells caused disease, still lingered among some. But germ theory advocates reframed these efforts as preventing bacterial spread. Either way, the result was the same: cleaner streets, fewer open cesspits, and more attention to waste management. The clothing industry also played a role in the era's hygiene revolution. Laundry services became more accessible, and home washing technologies, such as hand-cranked wringers and improved washboards, allowed clothes to be cleaned more often. White cotton undergarments, which could be boiled and bleached, became fashionable among those who could afford them, partly for their association with purity and hygiene. The idea of changing into fresh clothes daily, once unthinkable for most, was slowly gaining ground among the middle class. Hair care saw similar advances. While daily shampooing was still rare, Victorians began to wash their hair more frequently, aided by commercially produced soaps and shampoos that promised a healthier scalp and shinier locks. Hairbrushes, particularly those made by firms like Mason Pearson, were marketed as essential tools for cleanliness as well as beauty. Advice literature urged women to brush their hair 100 strokes a night, not just to keep it smooth, but to stimulate the scalp and distribute natural oils, which was believed to improve hygiene. By this time, the language of hygiene had firmly merged with the language of respectability. Employers, especially in domestic service and retail, often had unwritten, and sometimes written, rules about personal cleanliness. A shop assistant or maid who appeared disheveled risked losing their job. This created a powerful economic incentive for the working class to adopt better hygiene habits, even when doing so required sacrifice or extra labor. Children, too, were swept into the new culture of cleanliness. School inspectors noted whether pupils had clean hands, faces, and nails, and some schools set aside time each morning for communal washing. Charitable organizations distributed soap and towels to poor families, framing these acts as both health measures and moral instruction. Illustrated children's books began including stories in which cleanliness was equated with goodness and dirtiness with laziness or vice. By the end of Queen Victoria's reign in 1901, the country was poised to enter the Edwardian era with hygiene standards that would have been unrecognizable to Britons of the early 1800s. While rural areas and the urban poor still lagged behind, the general direction was clear. The habits and infrastructure of daily cleanliness were becoming embedded in the fabric of society. This shift was not without its critics. Some writers argued that the obsession with hygiene had gone too far, turning into a form of social snobbery or even a means of controlling the poor. Others worried that excessive bathing and the overuse of soaps could weaken the skin or cause illness. Yet these voices were increasingly drowned out by the chorus of reformers, advertisers, and medical authorities promoting the benefits of modern cleanliness. In retrospect, the Victorian hygiene revolution was a curious blend of genuine scientific progress and old-fashioned moralizing. Germ theory gave people new tools to fight disease, but it was the Victorian love of propriety and order that ensured these tools were widely adopted. Soap was not just a cleanser, it was a badge of respectability. Clean clothes were not just comfortable, they were proof of self-discipline. And a spotless home was not merely free of germs, it was a reflection of one's moral worth. When the Edwardian era dawned, it inherited this intricate web of beliefs and practices. Bathrooms, bar soap, toothbrushes, laundered linens, and weekly hair washing were no longer luxuries for a select few, but aspirations for the many. The journey from the unwashed masses of early industrial Britain to the soap-scented parlors of late Victorian society had been long and uneven, but it had permanently altered the way Britons understood their bodies, their homes, and their place in the modern world. If there was one thing that the Victorian upper classes loved more than a cup of well-steeped Darjeeling tea, it was showing off their refinement through elaborate social gatherings. The polite world of drawing rooms, dining halls, and manicured gardens was not just about leisure. It was about status, influence, and carefully choreographed appearances. Here, every gesture, every choice of clothing, and even the arrangement of flowers in the centerpiece carried meaning. The social calendar of a well-to-do Victorian was a dizzying whirlwind of events. There were formal dinners, afternoon teas, musicales, private theater performances, charity galas, and the much-anticipated season in London. The season, running from late spring to early summer, was the high point of the social year, when wealthy families flocked to the capital to attend balls, opera nights, and endless parties designed to mingle eligible sons and daughters under the watchful eyes of their parents. It was not merely about entertainment. Social gatherings were crucial arenas for making advantageous marriages, securing business partnerships, and forging political alliances. A single conversation at the right table could lead to an introduction to a powerful investor or an invitation to a private club closed to all but the most elite. The careful dance of conversation, politeness, and discreet self-promotion was an art in itself. The setting mattered enormously. For the host, throwing a successful gathering meant crafting an atmosphere that reflected both their wealth and their taste. Dining rooms gleamed with polished silverware, crystal glasses, and bone china dishes. The table was often covered with an immaculate white cloth, adorned with elaborate floral arrangements, and, in some cases, small silver figurines to spark conversation. Gas lighting provided a warm glow, and servants moved quietly, refilling wine glasses or replacing courses without drawing attention. Menus were statements of sophistication. The well-heeled Victorians adored French cuisine, which was considered the height of culinary refinement. A multi-course dinner might begin with consommé or oyster soup, followed by fish, roasted game, and elaborate side dishes such as asparagus in hollandaise sauce or potatoes dauphine. The pièce de résistance could be a roast peacock. Yes, complete with feathers for display, or an intricate dessert like a spun sugar croquembouche. Each course was paired with carefully selected wines, often imported at great expense. Afternoon teas, though less formal, carried their own etiquette. Guests were greeted in the drawing room, where a low table would be laden with tiered trays of sandwiches, scones with clotted cream, and delicate pastries. The tea service itself was a performance. Silver teapots, china cups, and the ritual of pouring with the proper wrist movement. Choosing the wrong tea blend for the occasion might not ruin a reputation, but it certainly could raise eyebrows among the more discerning guests. Fashion was its own silent language at these events. Ladies wore gowns with the latest silhouettes, often inspired by Parisian fashion houses. Fabrics like silk, satin, and velvet were favored, and intricate beadwork or embroidery signaled both wealth and access to skilled dressmakers. Gloves were essential, as were elaborate hairstyles adorned with combs, ribbons, or fresh flowers. Gentlemen wore impeccably tailored suits or evening attire, complete with cravats or bow ties. A misplaced cufflink or scuffed shoe could mark a man as careless, or worse, socially unpolished. The rules of conversation were equally precise. Polite topics included art, literature, recent travel, and charitable works. Politics could be discussed, but only in a restrained and witty manner. Open arguments were considered distasteful. Direct talk of money, illness, or scandal was avoided, unless one wished to court social ruin. A successful conversationalist was not necessarily the one who spoke the most, but the one who could listen attentively, make clever observations, and subtly highlight their own achievements without boasting. Behind all the refinement, however, lay an undercurrent of social maneuvering. Invitations were currency, and being excluded from a major ball or salon could be a significant social blow. Hosts often kept meticulous guest lists, balancing old alliances with new connections, and sometimes deliberately leaving out certain names to make a statement. To receive an invitation from a particularly influential hostess was not just a sign of favor, it could mark the turning point in a family's social fortunes. Even the seating arrangements at a dinner party were deliberate. A skilled host might place a shy young lady next to a charming conversationalist to bring her out of her shell, or seat a visiting foreign dignitary beside a business magnate with interests in their country. In this way, the dining table became a stage for subtle diplomacy. Entertainment varied depending on the scale of the event. After dinner, the group might retire to the drawing room for music, perhaps a guest playing piano or singing an aria. Private theatricals were popular in wealthier households, as were readings from popular novels or poetry. On warm evenings, garden parties allowed for croquet, lawn tennis, or leisurely strolls under lantern-lit trees. For all their elegance, these gatherings could be exhausting. Hosts often spent weeks planning, spending lavishly to ensure their soirees were remembered for the right reasons. Guests, too, felt the pressure. Attending event after event in the height of the season meant keeping up appearances, maintaining a wardrobe of ever-changing outfits, and engaging in constant social performance. Yet for those who thrived in this environment, the rewards were undeniable. A single evening might cement a romantic engagement, secure a political ally, or open the door to lucrative investments. The Victorian upper classes understood that society was not just a backdrop to life. It was a powerful engine that drove opportunity, ambition, and influence. While the grand events of the Victorian social calendar dazzled with their scale and glamour, much of the real influence was exercised in more intimate settings. Smaller gatherings, private dinners, salon evenings, or exclusive garden teas offered opportunities for closer conversation and deeper alliances. In these settings, the rules of etiquette were just as strict, if not more so, for the stakes could be higher when one's words were heard by only a few. The art of the salon was a refined skill among certain hostesses. A salon was more than just a room. It was an intellectual arena disguised as a social occasion. Guests might include novelists, painters, scientists, and political thinkers, carefully balanced with titled aristocrats and wealthy patrons. Conversation here could stray into more daring territory than at a large ball, debating a newly published novel, the latest archaeological discoveries in Egypt, or the moral implications of industrial progress. Still, even in these slightly freer environments, one had to tread lightly. Wit was applauded, but offensiveness could lead to swift ostracism. The hostess of a successful salon was a subtle conductor, guiding the flow of discussion, ensuring that quieter voices were heard, and smoothing over moments of awkwardness. She needed a keen memory for details. Who had quarreled with whom? Who was likely to take offense at certain remarks? And who might be amenable to a particular introduction? Many of these women wielded real, if unofficial, political influence, shaping opinions and alliances without ever stepping into parliament. Courtship rituals often played out in these semi-private spaces. A gentleman interested in a lady might request permission to call upon her at her family's home. This was no casual visit. Calls were a structured affair. The caller would be shown into the drawing room, where conversation might last no more than 15 minutes. If the lady's mother or chaperone approved of the match, Invitations to larger family dinners or outings could follow. A shared moment at a garden party, a dance at a ball, or a stroll along Rotten Row in Hyde Park all served as pieces of an unspoken romantic negotiation. In public spaces, couples were never truly alone. Chaperones, often mothers, aunts, or trusted older family friends, ensured that propriety was maintained. Physical contact was minimal, and even private conversations were constrained by the presence of others. The rules were so exacting that dropping one's handkerchief or a gentleman offering his arm to help a lady step into a carriage could be interpreted as subtle flirtations. The theater and opera were major social hubs. These were not merely artistic events. They were occasions to be seen. Wealthy families held subscription boxes, lavishly decorated with plush seating and curtains, from which they could observe the performance and, more importantly, the audience. Intermissions were often as socially significant as the play itself, with promenades through the lobby serving as opportunities to greet acquaintances and exchange whispered gossip. A strategically timed appearance at the opera could spark a new social connection or rekindle an old alliance. Similarly, clubs and gentlemen's societies served as key centers of influence for men. Prestigious clubs like the Athenaeum or the Reform Club were places where politicians, businessmen, and intellectuals could meet behind closed doors. Entry was highly selective, requiring nomination by current members and approval through a vote. Inside, deals were made over brandy, and friendships formed on the billiards table could translate into parliamentary support or business partnerships. The women's equivalent was often less formal, though ladies' charitable organizations and literary societies provided their own networks of influence. Philanthropy was considered a respectable outlet for women of status, and running a successful charity not only demonstrated virtue but also connected a lady with donors, political patrons, and society figures. Fundraising events, whether a bazaar, a musical recital, or an art exhibition, were also opportunities to display social grace while subtly reinforcing one's position among the elite. Charity work itself had its own social etiquette. While many Victorians genuinely believed in helping the less fortunate, charity could also serve as a performance of moral superiority. Benefactors might visit orphanages, hospitals, or poorhouses, their appearances carefully noted in society columns. A well-publicized act of generosity could improve a family's reputation just as surely as a well-attended ball. The delicate balance was in appearing compassionate without seeming self-serving, a balance that the most socially adept managed with practiced ease. The interplay between public image and private ambition meant that gossip was both a social lubricant and a potential weapon. While open slander was frowned upon, information, true or exaggerated, moved swiftly through the drawing rooms and tea tables of the upper classes. Being the subject of favorable whispers could enhance one's prospects. Being the target of malicious rumors could spell disaster. This made discretion a prized virtue, and the best-connected individuals knew when to speak and when to let a raised eyebrow do the talking. Even travel could be a form of social performance. Well-to-do Victorians embarked on grand tours of Europe, returning with tales of Italian art, Parisian fashion, and alpine vistas. These stories, told over dinners and teas, not only entertained but also signaled sophistication, education, and the financial means to see the world. Souvenirs, whether a carved Venetian mirror or a rare book from Florence, were displayed prominently, tangible proof of one's cultured life. As the century progressed, Industrialization and the expansion of the middle class began to shift the makeup of these social circles. Newly wealthy industrialists sought entry into aristocratic society, while some members of the old landed gentry resisted the influx of new money. The drawing room became a quiet battleground where lineage and fortune vied for dominance, and a skilled host could bridge or widen the gap with the right mix of invitations. Ultimately, the social world of Victorian Britain was a living chessboard. Every interaction, whether at a glittering ball, a quiet salon, or a sunlit tea table, was a potential move in the game. Success depended not just on wealth, beauty, or intelligence, but on a deep understanding of the unspoken rules that governed every glance, every handshake, and every carefully chosen word. If the Roman army's adaptability in tactics and formations was its brain, then its ability to integrate conquered peoples into its military machine was its heart. Nowhere is this more evident than in the development and deployment of auxilia, non-citizen troops recruited from Rome's provinces. These men, often drawn from regions with unique combat traditions, brought specialized skills the legions lacked. Syrian archers, Balearic slingers, Numidian cavalry, and Cretan bowmen became a vital complement to the heavy infantry. In return for 25 years of service, auxiliary were rewarded with Roman citizenship, a powerful incentive that bound their loyalty to the empire. By the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, the Roman army was not just an Italian force. It was a multinational institution. A legionary might find himself marching alongside men from Gaul, Thrace, Germania, or Judea. This diversity did not dilute Rome's military effectiveness. Rather, it enriched it. Each contingent contributed its own strengths, while Roman training and discipline forged them into a cohesive unit. Military camps became melting pots of culture, where Latin served as the lingua franca, but local traditions persisted in music, food, and religious practices. Life inside a castra, fort, followed a rigorous schedule. Soldiers awoke at dawn, performed roll call, and then embarked on their daily duties. Weapons training, construction work, guard shifts, and patrols. The Romans famously rotated duties to prevent fatigue and boredom. Even in peacetime, soldiers practiced mock battles, honed their swordsmanship, and maintained physical conditioning. The discipline was relentless because Roman commanders understood a hard truth. Armies rust without constant exercise. Forts themselves were marvels of standardization. Whether stationed along the Rhine frontier or in the deserts of Syria, a Roman fort shared a similar layout, a rectangular perimeter with rounded corners, surrounded by ditches and ramparts, intersected by two main roads, the Via Praetoria and Via Principalis, that met at the headquarters building, Principia. Inside, soldiers were housed in barracks, usually 8 men to a contubernium room, sharing a hearth and sleeping space. Officers enjoyed more spacious quarters, complete with private dining rooms and sometimes even bathhouses. Military discipline could be harsh. Disobedience or cowardice in battle was punished severely, sometimes by decimatio, the execution of 1 in 10 men in a disgraced unit. Lesser offenses might be met with flogging, extra guard duty, or reduced rations. Yet this severity bred an unshakable cohesion. The legion was more than a job. It was a brotherhood forged in hardship, where the man beside you was your shield in battle and your companion in camp. Beyond the battlefield, Roman soldiers served as agents of Romanization. Wherever they were posted, they introduced Roman engineering, laws, and customs. Roads, aqueducts, amphitheaters, and temples often sprang up around military bases. Many veterans chose to settle in the provinces where they had served, marrying local women and founding new communities. These settlements often grew into Romanized towns, their inhabitants speaking Latin and adopting Roman civic institutions. Economically, the army was a powerhouse. Soldiers were paid regular wages, modest by modern standards, but steady and dependable. They also received bonuses, donativa, on special occasions, such as the accession of a new emperor. Much of this pay found its way into the local economy, enriching merchants, craftsmen, and farmers who supplied the army with goods. When discharged, veterans received a generous cash sum or a plot of land, ensuring they remained economically tied to Rome's stability. Religiously, the Roman army was a microcosm of the empire's spiritual diversity. Officially, loyalty to the gods of Rome, particularly Jupiter Optimus Maximus, was expected, and sacrifices were performed regularly for the army's welfare. However, soldiers were generally free to worship their own deities alongside the official cults. Mithraism, a mystery religion from the East, became especially popular among the legions, as did the worship of local gods absorbed into the Roman pantheon. This tolerance fostered unity, allowing soldiers from disparate backgrounds to see themselves as part of a shared sacred order. Despite its strengths, the Roman military machine was not invincible. Prolonged campaigns could strain supply lines, especially in hostile terrain. Harsh climates, from the damp forests of Germania to the arid sands of Mesopotamia, took their toll on both men and equipment. Enemy forces adapted, learning to exploit the rigidity of Roman formations or to harass supply convoys. Over time, the heavy infantry model that had served Rome so well in the Mediterranean faced increasing challenges on its long, exposed frontiers. Still, the sheer resilience of the Roman army remained staggering. For centuries, it maintained security across a territory of unprecedented size, not only defeating enemies but integrating them. The genius of Rome lay not just in its ability to conquer, but in its capacity to transform conquest into enduring order. Each soldier, whether a legionary from the Italian heartland or an auxiliary from the edge of the empire, was part of a grand project, the making and maintenance of Pax Romana. As the 2nd century drew to a close, the Roman army stood at the height of its power, professional, disciplined, and deeply woven into the fabric of the empire. Yet, in the centuries ahead, the very traits that had made it strong would face new and unforeseen tests. The frontiers would grow restless. The costs of maintaining such a vast force would balloon, and the balance between central authority and frontier autonomy would be challenged. But for now, in the golden years of imperial strength, the legions marched beneath the eagle standards, their armor glinting in the sun, confident in their purpose and in the eternal might of Rome. They were the embodiment of order amid chaos. A force as much about building as destroying, as much about uniting as conquering. The Victorian public's understanding of these distant events was shaped by the media of the day. Illustrated newspapers like The Graphic and the Illustrated London News brought dramatic sketches of battles, exotic wildlife, and native leaders to coffee tables across Britain. Yet these depictions often filtered reality through the lens of imperial propaganda, emphasizing heroism and downplaying complexity. For those who never left Britain, the empire could feel both vast and strangely abstract, a distant stage where Britain's greatness was acted out. But for sailors, soldiers, traders, and missionaries, it was an everyday reality. Letters home from abroad told of strange climates, new foods, and unfamiliar customs. Some recounted hardship and danger, others opportunity and fortune. In either case, these personal accounts added to the empire's mystique, blending fact with romanticized narrative. By the turn of the century, the empire's role in shaping Victorian society was undeniable. It influenced what people ate and drank, how they dressed, the stories they read, and the political debates that filled Parliament. It also carried with it contradictions, claims of spreading progress alongside systems of exploitation, images of unity alongside deep divisions. In the decades to come, these tensions would only grow more pronounced, setting the stage for debates that would continue well into the 20th century. While the empire loomed large in Victorian identity, its influence on the domestic economy was particularly profound. London had long been a commercial hub, but by the late 19th century it had transformed into a true global financial center. Banks, insurance companies, and trading houses clustered in the city of London, facilitating the flow of capital and goods between Britain and its colonies. The wealth generated from imperial trade did not simply line the pockets of a few industrial magnates. It filtered into construction, infrastructure, and public works that reshaped the urban landscape. Railway expansion, for instance, was partly fueled by colonial profits. Tracks snaked their way through both bustling cities and remote countryside, connecting ports to inland manufacturing towns and allowing goods to move quickly from dock to market. Ports themselves expanded dramatically. Liverpool's Albert Dock became a symbol of Victorian engineering and imperial commerce, capable of handling vast quantities of cargo from all over the globe. These developments weren't just economic milestones. They were visible proof, to many Victorians, of Britain's global dominance. Imperial wealth also found its way into philanthropic ventures. Prominent businessmen and aristocrats, enriched by overseas enterprises, sponsored museums, libraries, schools, and hospitals. Figures like Andrew Carnegie, though Scottish-American, were part of a broader trend where immense fortunes were redirected into public service projects. The Victoria and Albert Museum, for example, was founded in the spirit of public education and the promotion of design excellence. But it was also a showcase for the empire's artistic acquisitions. Even public parks, such as those in industrial cities like Birmingham and Manchester, were sometimes financed by benefactors with colonial interests. Yet, for the working classes, the benefits of the empire were less tangible. While imported goods such as tea, sugar, and cheap cotton fabrics became accessible, the profits of empire rarely translated into better wages or working conditions. In industrial centers, factory labor remained grueling and housing overcrowded. Critics pointed out that while Britain boasted of civilizing its colonies, many of its own citizens lived in conditions barely better than those of the people it claimed to uplift abroad. Reformers like Charles Booth and Seabohm Rowntree documented the depth of urban poverty, challenging the idea that imperial success equated to domestic prosperity. Culturally, Imperial ideology seeped into almost every aspect of Victorian life. Schools taught geography and history with an imperial slant, emphasizing Britain's role as a benevolent ruler over less developed nations. Maps in classrooms and atlases in drawing rooms were often colored in the familiar red, marking British territories around the globe. Poetry, theater, and art frequently celebrated imperial adventures, from naval victories to tales of exploration in Africa and Asia. This imperial narrative also had a moral dimension. Missionary societies, backed by church donations and public subscriptions, sent men and women abroad to spread Christianity in Western education. The London Missionary Society and the Church Missionary Society were particularly active, sending their representatives to remote corners of Africa, the Pacific Islands, and China. These missionaries often wrote home with dramatic accounts of their work, reinforcing the notion that the empire was a moral as well as a political and economic enterprise. However, these same accounts often revealed the clash between Victorian values and local traditions, highlighting cultural tensions that would persist long after the missionaries had moved on. For the Victorian middle classes, the empire also offered new opportunities for personal advancement. Young men might seek commissions in the colonial civil service, posts in foreign trade companies, or roles as engineers on overseas infrastructure projects. Service abroad could be a stepping stone to wealth and status back home, though it often came with considerable personal risk from tropical diseases, unfamiliar climates, and political instability. Women, too, participated in imperial life, sometimes as missionaries, sometimes accompanying husbands on foreign assignments, and occasionally as teachers or nurses in colonial settlements. The empire's diversity also raised questions about identity and belonging. Encounters with colonial subjects, whether through travel, exhibitions, or immigration, challenged Victorians' perceptions of race and culture. The growing presence of non-European peoples in Britain, often as sailors, students, or performers, sparked both fascination and prejudice. While some embraced the novelty, others reacted with suspicion, reinforcing rigid social and racial hierarchies. Pseudo-scientific theories about racial differences gained popularity, shaping public attitudes and even influencing policy. Not all imperial interactions were harmonious. In the colonies, resistance to British rule was often met with military force. The Zulu War of 1879, the suppression of the Mahdist revolt in Sudan, and the various frontier campaigns in India were costly both in lives and in political capital. Reports of these conflicts, often romanticized in the press, masked the brutality of the fighting and the heavy toll it took on local populations. At home, however, such military campaigns were frequently presented as noble endeavors, proof of Britain's ability to project power and maintain order in its far-flung territories. The press played a crucial role in sustaining this image. Illustrated weeklies like Punch often used satire to comment on imperial affairs, but even their humor tended to support the idea of Britain's moral superiority. War correspondents sent vivid accounts from the front lines, though their stories were often shaped by the constraints of censorship and patriotic sentiment. This selective storytelling ensured that the empire remained, in the popular imagination, a mostly heroic enterprise. At the same time, a counter-narrative was beginning to emerge. Figures like J.A. Hobson criticized imperialism as a system designed to benefit a narrow elite at the expense of both colonial subjects and the British working class. Socialists and members of the burgeoning labor movement began to link the struggles of industrial workers with the exploitation of colonial labor, framing both as victims of the same capitalist system. These critiques, though still a minority view, hinted at the ideological battles that would intensify in the 20th century. By the close of the Victorian era, the empire had woven itself into the very fabric of British society. It was present in the food people ate, the language they spoke, the goods they purchased, and the values they were taught. It was a source of pride and controversy, opportunity and exploitation, cultural enrichment and cultural erasure. The tensions within this imperial system, between wealth and poverty, progress and oppression, unity and division, were increasingly visible, even if they were not yet fully understood. As the Victorian era wound toward its close, the British Empire faced growing complexities that tested its endurance and morality. The very forces that had built such a vast domain, industrial might, military power, and cultural confidence, also sowed the seeds of future challenges. In the colonies, demands for self-rule and respect for indigenous rights were beginning to stir, even if few in Britain fully grasped their significance yet. One of the most pressing issues was the question of governance. The British had experimented with direct rule, as in India under the Raj, and with more indirect methods, allowing local rulers some autonomy while controlling key levers of power. But the rising tide of nationalism in many colonies complicated these arrangements. The Indian National Congress, founded in 1885, sought reform and greater Indian participation in governance. Similarly, African leaders and intellectuals began organizing for political recognition and economic justice. Historians still argue whether these early movements planted the seeds for peaceful decolonization or if they merely delayed inevitable upheaval. Back home, the empire's costs became a hot-button issue. Maintaining distant garrisons, subsidizing colonial administrations, and subsidizing trade infrastructure drained public coffers. Meanwhile, the social reforms that had begun in Victorian Britain, education, public health, housing, required funding and attention. Some politicians contended that resources should be focused on home rule rather than overseas adventures. Others insisted that the empire was Britain's greatest asset and key to future prosperity. This tension between imperial commitment and domestic welfare shaped political debates into the 20th century. Culturally, the empire remained a double-edged sword. While it inspired art, literature, and public ceremonies that celebrated British identity, it also exposed contradictions. For example, the exposure to diverse cultures led some Victorians to question rigid racial hierarchies and stereotypes, though many clung fiercely to them. The period also saw the growth of imperial feminism, where some women supported empire building as a mission to civilize, but also advocated for women's rights in education both in Britain and abroad. These overlapping currents complicated the straightforward narratives of empire. The economic dimension also faced pressure. Global competition from rising powers like Germany and the United States challenged Britain's industrial and commercial dominance. Some economists worried that the empire's vastness was a liability, spreading resources thin and making the economy vulnerable. Others saw the empire as a vital shield and market that protected British industry in turbulent times. Public opinion toward the empire was increasingly nuanced. Spectacles like Queen Victoria's Golden and Diamond Jubilees in 1887 and 1897 celebrated imperial grandeur and fostered a sense of unity and pride. Yet the press began covering colonial conflicts with more skepticism, especially when they involved civilian suffering or high costs. The Second Boer War, 1899 to 1902, exposed many to the brutal realities of imperial warfare, sparking protests and debates about morality and imperial policy. This war, fought in South Africa against Boer settlers, was a reminder that empire was not always glorious or uncontested. One curious Victorian twist was how the empire's exoticism infiltrated domestic leisure. Zoos, botanical gardens, and ethnographic villages displayed people, plants, and animals from colonies as spectacles for urban audiences. While intended to educate and entertain, these exhibits often reduced cultures to caricatures, reinforcing stereotypes. This practice is now widely criticized but was accepted at the time as harmless curiosity. Meanwhile, new technologies like the telegraph and steamship shrank distances, allowing faster communication and travel within the empire. News from India or Africa reached London in days rather than months, enabling quicker responses to crises and tighter imperial control. Yet this also meant that failures or scandals could ignite public outrage more rapidly, increasing pressure on policymakers. Despite all the power and prestige, Victorian Britain's grip on its empire was not unshakable. The contradictions and tensions that had built up over decades between economic exploitation and cultural exchange, military dominance and indigenous resistance, imperial pride and domestic inequality, foreshadowed a century of transformation. The seeds planted during this era would eventually blossom into movements for independence, redefinitions of identity, and a reimagining of Britain's place in the world. So as you slowly drift from this glimpse into the vastness and complexity of the Victorian Empire, remember that behind every map, every colonial artifact, and every imperial celebration were millions of lives shaped by this extraordinary and often troubling system. The empire was not just a story of conquest and power. It was a tapestry woven with threads of human aspiration, conflict, and resilience. And in the quiet moments of history, those threads continue to shape our world today. You slowly shift in your seat, letting the weight of the empire's vastness settle for a moment before moving into the next chapter, the mysterious, sometimes murky world of Victorian disease and health. It's a world that feels almost like stepping into a fog, thick with confusion and fear, where every breath you take could carry invisible threats, and every neighborhood hides unseen dangers. And trust me, you're going to be so grateful that you don't have to worry about cholera or typhoid crashing your day-to-day. Victorian London, and much of Britain, was a place where diseases weren't just medical conditions. They were an ever-present reality shaping how people lived, worked, and even dreamed. Unlike the visible filth or the choking smoke from factories, disease was largely invisible, mysterious, and terrifying. Germ theory, the idea that tiny organisms cause illness, was just beginning to poke through the fog of misunderstanding. But most people still clung to older explanations. You might remember the miasma theory from earlier, a widely held belief that foul odors or bad air were the root cause of disease. This idea made intuitive sense at the time. Sick people often lived in smelly, dirty places, so it seemed logical that the smell itself was the poison. The stench of sewage-filled streets and stagnant water wasn't just unpleasant, it was feared as a deadly enemy. That's why Victorians sprayed perfume liberally, burned incense, or carried posies of flowers to ward off these noxious airs. It was an early form of masking sickness before science could fully explain it. The reality was, of course, more complicated. Disease spread mainly through contaminated water and poor sanitation. But because the germ theory wasn't widely accepted until the late 19th century, public health efforts were often misguided. Instead of targeting the actual cause, microbes in water and food, efforts focused on improving ventilation or eliminating bad smells, which only partially helped. Historians still argue whether these misdirected efforts delayed more effective reforms or bought precious time for scientific breakthroughs to take hold. Among the deadliest diseases haunting Victorian London was cholera, a swift and ruthless killer. The first major outbreak in Britain was in 1831, but it returned in waves throughout the century, each time sparking panic and tragic loss. Cholera was terrifying not just for its speed, but for the gruesome way it struck. Violent vomiting, diarrhea, and dehydration would rapidly drain victims, often killing them within hours or days. Entire families could be wiped out before neighbors even realized what was happening. What made cholera especially insidious was its connection to contaminated water sources. The Thames, already overburdened with sewage and industrial waste, became a breeding ground for the bacteria. This wasn't obvious to most people at the time. The idea of drinking clean water was still a luxury. Wells and pumps often pulled from polluted sources, unknowingly spreading disease. You can imagine how grim daily life was when even a sip of water could be a death sentence. But even as cholera tore through the city, some individuals were beginning to piece the puzzle together. Dr. John Snow, a physician, famously investigated the 1854 Soho outbreak and traced cases to a contaminated public water pump on Broad Street. By removing the pump's handle, he effectively stopped the outbreak, proving the link between water and disease. This was a landmark moment, yet his ideas met resistance. Medical authorities and the public were slow to accept that invisible germs, not just bad smells, caused illness. Alongside cholera, tuberculosis, known as consumption, because it seemed to consume people from within, was another scourge. Unlike cholera's rapid assault, TB was a slow-burning illness, causing a persistent cough, weight loss, and night sweats. It spread easily in overcrowded, poorly ventilated homes, making the cramped Victorian slums a perfect breeding ground. Some even romanticized consumption, associating it with delicate beauty and artistic sensitivity, a strange cultural twist that didn't help sufferers get the care they needed. Typhoid fever also stalked the population, caused by bacteria in contaminated food and water. Outbreaks were common in areas where sewage and drinking water systems were poorly separated. The symptoms, high fever, abdominal pain, and rash, were debilitating and sometimes fatal. Like cholera, typhoid outbreaks highlighted the desperate need for sanitation reform, but often fell victim to the same misunderstanding about disease transmission. The fear of disease extended beyond physical health to the social sphere. Illness was often stigmatized, especially diseases linked to poverty or immoral behavior. The Victorian obsession with cleanliness extended to moral cleanliness as well. Tuberculosis, for example, was sometimes viewed as a punishment for a weak character or sinful lifestyle, rather than a contagious disease. This stigma affected how people sought care and how communities treated the sick. Despite these challenges, the Victorian era was also a time of remarkable medical innovation and public health progress. The establishment of the Metropolitan Board of Works and later the London County Council took steps to improve water supply and sewage disposal, aiming to break the cycle of disease. Vaccination campaigns began to take root, especially for smallpox, another feared illness that ravaged communities. Public hospitals and infirmaries grew in number, offering care to the poor who had few options otherwise. Medical professionals started adopting antiseptic techniques pioneered by Joseph Lister, drastically reducing infections in surgical wards. The Victorian medical landscape was a mix of desperate need and groundbreaking hope, a world caught between old fears and new science. So, as you sit there breathing easy, remember that for Victorians, every day was a gamble against invisible enemies. Their struggles with disease were not just about biology, but about changing ideas, social attitudes, and the slow march of progress. It's a reminder of how far we've come, and how much courage it took to confront the unknown. Settling deeper into your chair, you begin to imagine the day-to-day reality for Victorians navigating this world of disease and fear. For most, life was a delicate balancing act, where every choice, from what water to drink to where to live, carried hidden risks. Picture the cramped tenements with narrow alleys where children played, unaware that just a few steps away, sewage leaked into the street, or that a contaminated water pump might be their only source of hydration. In these neighborhoods, the boundaries between health and illness were porous. Families often lived cheek by jowl, with dozens packed into a single house. Privacy was a luxury. Sickness was shared as readily as the air. When one person fell ill, it was almost inevitable that others would soon follow. The emotional toll was immense. Grief and anxiety were constant companions in Victorian homes. One quirky but telling tidbit about Victorian approaches to illness involves the use of health cures that now seem strange or even dangerous. For example, the popular practice of fresh air therapy led to the widespread use of open-air schools and sanatoriums, where patients, especially children with tuberculosis, were exposed to cool, crisp air and sunlight. It was believed that fresh air could purify the body and spirit, a concept both poetic and practical given the grim indoor conditions. Of course, historians still argue whether such therapies genuinely improved outcomes or mainly offered psychological comfort and a break from pollution. Doctors and families also turned to herbal remedies, tinctures, and potions to treat symptoms. The Victorian medicine cabinet was stocked with concoctions ranging from soothing chamomile to dangerous compounds like laudanum, a tincture of opium that soothed pain but was highly addictive. While some treatments brought relief, many did more harm than good, often masking symptoms or weakening patients further. The limits of medical knowledge and the absence of regulation made Victorian healthcare a risky gamble. Another notable aspect of Victorian disease was the role of childbirth, a perilous event even in the best circumstances. Maternal mortality was tragically high, often caused by puerperal fever, a bacterial infection contracted after delivery. Hospitals, where many women gave birth, were ironically hotspots for infection due to lack of sanitation and understanding of germs. The famous work of Ignaz Semmelweis in the 1840s who showed that hand washing by doctors dramatically reduced infections, was ignored for years, a historical tragedy in itself. It's chilling to realize how many mothers and babies suffered due to these delays in adopting simple hygiene. Meanwhile, childhood diseases like measles, scarlet fever, and whooping cough claimed countless young lives. Vaccination for some diseases was in its infancy, and while smallpox vaccination became more common, access and acceptance varied widely. Families often relied on folk wisdom or prayer in the face of illness, reflecting a blend of hope, desperation, and faith. Mental health, though rarely discussed openly, was another shadowy aspect of Victorian illness. Conditions we now understand as depression, anxiety, or psychosis were often misunderstood, stigmatized, or dismissed. Institutions for the mentally ill were frequently overcrowded and underfunded, and treatments could be harsh or ineffective. Victorian society's emphasis on stoicism and moral strength often left sufferers isolated and silenced. Through all this, public health pioneers fought to change the landscape. The work of Edwin Chadwick and others led to the 1848 Public Health Act, aiming to improve water supply, sewage, and housing conditions. Though enforcement was uneven and resources limited, these efforts gradually reduced the worst hazards. The construction of sewers, better waste disposal, and cleaner water sources slowly changed the face of cities. Historians still debate how much these reforms were driven by humanitarian concern versus economic self-interest. After all, a healthier workforce was a more productive one. Meanwhile, the press played a critical role in raising awareness. Sensational newspaper stories about outbreaks, squalor, and government inaction sparked public outrage. Novels and plays often highlighted the grim realities of disease and poverty, shaping public perceptions and pressuring. One surprisingly modern aspect of Victorian public health was the concept of quarantine and isolation. People with contagious diseases were often confined to hospitals or pest houses to prevent spread, though conditions were harsh and facilities limited. The tension between individual freedom and public safety was as real then as it is now, sparking debates about civil rights that echo into our own time. All these factors made Victorian disease not just a medical issue, but a social, political, and cultural battleground. The interplay of fear, ignorance, progress, and stubborn tradition created a complex environment where every breath was a mixture of hope and hazard. As you absorb these details, you might notice how the Victorian struggle with disease feels strangely familiar. Echoes of uncertainty, misinformation, and fear that resonate even in the modern world. The era's journey from miasma to germ theory, from superstition to science, reminds us how knowledge and compassion must travel hand in hand. Now, with that heavy thought lingering softly, you settle deeper, ready to move into the final part of this section, where we'll explore how the Victorian public's understanding of disease finally shifted gears and laid the groundwork for modern medicine. As you lean back, the swirling fog of Victorian disease begins to clear just a little, and the story takes a hopeful turn. Despite all the confusion, fear, and tragedy, the late 19th century witnessed breakthroughs that would transform how London and the world understood and fought disease. One of the biggest turning points was the gradual acceptance of germ theory, largely thanks to the work of Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch. Pasteur's experiments proved that microorganisms caused fermentation and spoilage, paving the way for the idea that these tiny creatures could cause illness too. Koch identified the specific bacteria responsible for diseases like tuberculosis and cholera, bringing the invisible enemy into sharper focus. This scientific revolution challenged centuries of assumptions and overturned the miasma theory that had dominated public health. But science doesn't spread overnight. In Victorian England, these new ideas faced skepticism and resistance. Medical professionals, politicians, and the public were often slow to change habits deeply rooted in tradition and everyday experience. After all, it was easier to blame bad air than to overhaul an entire city's infrastructure and confront uncomfortable truths about poverty and sanitation. Historians still argue about how much social and political factors delayed this shift, but the change was inevitable and profound. Public health campaigns increasingly emphasized cleanliness, not just of the body but of the environment. Towns and cities began investing in clean water systems, sewage treatment, and garbage collection. Hospitals adopted antiseptic techniques pioneered by Joseph Lister, dramatically reducing infections after surgery. Doctors started promoting hand washing, sterilized instruments, and isolation of infectious patients. These changes saved countless lives and laid the foundation for modern medicine. But Victorian society's understanding of disease also shaped how people lived their daily lives. Wearing clean clothes, bathing more regularly, and improving home ventilation became markers of respectability and health. The rise of public bathhouses made hygiene more accessible to the poor, even if full-body bathing was still uncommon at home. Toothbrushes became more affordable, and dental care slowly improved, though many people still struggled with primitive methods. Even perfume, once used to mask smells believed to cause disease, found a new role as a symbol of personal cleanliness and social status. The irony is rich. A scent once thought to protect from illness evolved into a fashion statement and a sign of modern hygiene. Victorian literature and culture also reflected these shifts. Novels and newspapers began depicting doctors as heroes fighting invisible enemies, and stories of epidemics carried warnings and hope. The public became more aware of the connections between environment, behavior, and health, a massive leap from earlier centuries. Yet, challenges remained. Poverty, overcrowding, and inequality still fueled disease outbreaks. Access to healthcare was uneven, and stigma around certain illnesses persisted. Mental health remained poorly understood and inadequately treated. But the Victorian era's slow transformation from superstition to science opened doors for the 20th century's medical advances, including vaccines, antibiotics, and sanitation engineering. So, as you breathe a slow, deep breath, appreciating the clean air and modern medicine surrounding you, take a moment to honor those Victorians who lived through this turbulent era. They wrestled with unseen enemies, embraced new knowledge, and struggled against conditions that would break many spirits. Their courage, curiosity, and resilience helped shape the world we inherit today. As the fog lifts and your eyelids grow heavy, remember, understanding disease is not just about science. It's about people, their lives, fears, and hopes. The Victorian journey teaches us how knowledge can illuminate darkness and how progress often comes from the hardest battles fought quietly, day by day. Now, ease into a calm, restful state, letting the echoes of this strange, challenging time fade gently into the night. You're settling in, letting the heavy curtain of night draw softly around you. And here we are at the last stretch of this journey through Victorian London's tangled web of grime, smell, and survival. Tonight, we focus on a tale of desperation, ingenuity, and eventual triumph. The revolution of London's sewer system. This story is about more than just pipes and waste. It's about the courage to face a city's darkest problems and remake its very foundation. Imagine it's the summer of 1858. London is baking under a heat wave so fierce that even the usually hardy city dwellers are staggering from the smell alone. The Thames, that great river flowing through the heart of the city, has transformed from a life-giving artery to what newspapers call a deadly sewer. What used to be a source of drinking water is now a toxic soup of human waste, industrial effluent, and decay. The hot sun turns the filth into a simmering stew, releasing a stench so powerful it drives people indoors, forces public events to be cancelled, and, most notably, sends the halls of Parliament into chaos. Members of Parliament themselves, those men and women charged with running the country, are gagging, waving handkerchiefs soaked in perfumed liquids to mask the odor. Windows are thrown open, but it only makes things worse, filling the chambers with an unbearable miasma. The situation is so bad that there's talk of moving the entire government away from Westminster to escape the smell. This moment, known as the Great Stink, shocks a complacent society into action. Now, here's a quirky detail. Despite the horrors of the Great Stink, some Londoners developed a strange sort of familiarity with the foul odors. Some even joked that the smell was a permanent London perfume, a bizarre badge of city pride, as if the filth was just another local character. But make no mistake, this was no laughing matter. It was a public health emergency of epic proportions. At the center of the solution was Joseph Bazalgette, a civil engineer tasked with a gargantuan challenge. He was the man who would redesign London's guts, the brains behind the mammoth sewer system that would ultimately save millions of lives. Bazalgette's plan was audacious. Build a vast network of underground sewers to intercept waste before it reached the Thames, carry it far downstream, and prevent the river from becoming the city's garbage dump. Historians still debate whether Bazalgette fully grasped the scientific breakthrough of germ theory or if his work was motivated more by the immediate need to end the smell and prevent cholera outbreaks. Regardless, his engineering genius was undeniable. He designed over 1,100 miles of sewer tunnels beneath London's streets, using massive pumping stations to move sewage uphill and away from the crowded city centers. Visualize workers digging deep trenches, carting mud and human waste, braving dreadful conditions as they built this underground labyrinth. Entire neighborhoods were torn apart during construction, and thousands of families were displaced. The scale of the project was staggering, especially considering the limited technology of the day. Meanwhile, political debates raged. Should funds be allocated to this massive infrastructure overhaul? Would Londoners tolerate the disruption? Was the government ready to face the reality that years of ignoring public health had consequences? The Great Stink forced the answer. Yes, it was time for radical change. The construction took years, with constant noise, dust, and grime clouding the city above. The smell of fresh bricks mixed with the lingering stench of sewage, a strange juxtaposition of decay and renewal. And when it was finally complete, the system didn't just improve sanitation. It transformed London's very character. The Thames began to clear. Diseases like cholera decreased dramatically, and the city grew healthier. It's remarkable to think that this pioneering project set a global example. Other cities followed suit, realizing that modern urban life demanded modern waste management. Bazalgette's sewers remain in use today, a testament to his vision and determination. So, as you sink deeper into comfort, remember the Victorian struggle wasn't just about enduring filth or bad smells. It was about imagining a cleaner, healthier future and having the resolve to build it. The Great Stink and the Sewer Revolution symbolize humanity's ability to confront its darkest challenges, plumbing the depths not only of the city's streets but also of its courage. You're nestled deeper into that cozy spot now. And as the night stretches on, let's continue unraveling the story of London's sewer revolution. The sweat, the grime, and the extraordinary vision that changed everything. Bazalgette's grand design wasn't just about pipes. It was about people, progress, and a stubborn refusal to accept the status quo. The challenge was immense. London's population was booming, with more than 3 million souls crammed into crowded streets and tiny homes. Every day, those millions produced an unfathomable amount of waste, and the existing cesspools and open drains were bursting at the seams. The old system was like trying to hold back a tidal wave with a paper towel. Sewage often overflowed into streets and cellars, contaminating water sources and spreading deadly diseases. Bazalgette's plan involved intercepting sewage before it could reach the Thames. He envisioned a network of intercepting sewers running parallel to the river on both banks, collecting waste from smaller local sewers. These massive conduits would then carry everything downstream, well past the city limits, where it could be safely released at high tide. The project included 3 enormous pumping stations at Abbey Mills, Crossness, and Deptford that pushed sewage uphill to these interceptors, overcoming London's famously flat terrain. One of the most remarkable aspects of Bazalgette's work was his attention to detail and future-proofing. He famously over-engineered his sewers, making the tunnels larger than strictly necessary to accommodate London's growth. His calculations were meticulous, and it said he used detailed maps and surveys to plot every inch of the system. This foresight meant that the sewer network still serves London today, more than 150 years later, a testament to his engineering genius. But the project wasn't without controversy. The cost was enormous, estimated at around £4 million, a fortune in Victorian times. Critics grumbled about spending so much on underground pipes, questioning if the stink really justified such investment. Political opponents called it a wasteful extravagance, and some Londoners feared the disruption would make their daily lives unbearable. And disruption there certainly was. Streets were torn up, traffic rerouted, and construction noise was constant. The labor force was vast and grueling. Thousands of workers, many immigrants and laborers from poor backgrounds, toiled in dangerous conditions. They dug deep tunnels, often by hand, sometimes in noxious fumes and muddy water. Accidents were common, and the work was exhausting. Yet the workers pushed on, driven by wages and the hope that their efforts would bring lasting change to the city. In the meantime, public health crises continued to loom. Cholera outbreaks haunted London's memory, with deadly epidemics striking roughly every decade in the mid-1800s. These outbreaks spread rapidly through contaminated water, fueled by the cesspools and filthy streets. The fear of cholera was a powerful motivator for reform, even if many Victorians still clung to the miasma theory. Historians still argue about how much the sewer system alone halted cholera. Some believe that improvements in water supply and better public hygiene played equally important roles. What's undeniable, though, is that Bazalgette's sewers drastically reduced raw sewage pollution in the Thames, making the river safer and cleaner than it had been for centuries. Another quirky Victorian tidbit: while Bazalgette's system was being built, some people actually kept collecting and selling human waste, the night soil men, because farmers valued it as fertilizer. This practice continued well into the late 19th century, creating a strange cycle where the city's filth fertilized crops far outside its limits. The health implications of this recycling were dubious, but it was an early example of waste repurposing in a city struggling with its own byproducts. As the sewer network neared completion in the 1870s, the Thames began its slow recovery. Fish returned to the river, and the foul odors diminished dramatically. The great stink faded from memory, replaced by a cleaner, healthier river that supported commerce and recreation. The project also inspired advances in waste treatment and urban sanitation worldwide, influencing cities from Paris to New York. Londoners embraced their newfound ability to flush away filth, literally and figuratively. Bathrooms with flush toilets gradually became common, replacing chamber pots and shared privies. Indoor plumbing, running water, and regular waste removal slowly transformed daily life, marking the dawn of modern urban hygiene. Yet, it's worth remembering that the sewer revolution was just one piece of a larger puzzle. Alongside engineering feats, advances in medical science, social reform, and public education all played roles in improving Victorian health. It was a complex interplay of technology, knowledge, and human will. So, as you breathe in the fresh night air, remember that the stench-filled streets and the great stink were catalysts, not just horrors to endure, but sparks that ignited progress. Joseph Bazalgette's legacy reminds us that even the most unpleasant problems, when faced with determination and ingenuity, can lead to transformative change. Now, as you settle further into the calm of the night, let the story of London's gritty struggle with its own waste and the triumphant engineering that followed lull you deeper toward rest. The past is messy, but it is also full of resilience and hope. You're comfortably cocooned now, the night stretching quietly around you, and here we close this long journey through Victorian London's tangled history of grime, hardship, and eventual transformation. As we wind down, let's explore the final pieces of this complex story, the lingering misunderstandings, human adaptability, and the lessons we carry forward. Despite all the engineering marvels and sanitation reforms, many Victorians clung to the idea of the miasma theory, that foul smells themselves caused disease. This belief shaped their behavior for decades, with some even wearing scented handkerchiefs pressed over their noses or lighting incense to ward off the bad air. It's a curious reminder of how difficult it can be to shake off long-held ideas, especially when science is still catching up. In a strange twist, this misconception meant that efforts to improve hygiene often focused more on masking smells than eliminating sources of infection. Perfume, colognes, and flowers were used liberally to cover the stench of unwashed bodies and polluted streets. In fact, some historians argue that this focus on scent delayed more effective public health interventions because it distracted from the real cause: contaminated water and poor sanitation. On the other hand, this human tendency to adapt and find ways to cope is part of what made Victorian Londoners so resilient. They lived amidst discomfort and filth, but still carved out moments of joy, humor, and community. Sharing cramped rooms, reusing bath water, washing hair with eggs or vinegar. These were not just survival tactics, but parts of a shared culture born of necessity. There's also an open debate among scholars about how much the rapid urbanization of London accelerated both the problems and the solutions. Some argue that the swelling population overwhelmed existing systems too fast, making outbreaks and filth inevitable. Others point to how this growth pushed innovation, forcing society to confront its limits and create modern infrastructure that still serves as a foundation today. And what about the people behind the scenes? The workers, the maids, the night soilmen. Often overlooked, their labor was essential. They endured the worst conditions, cleaning up after the wealthy and poor alike, sometimes at great personal risk. Their stories remind us that progress is not only about brilliant engineers and grand designs, but also about the countless hands that make change possible. Remember, too, that Victorian hygiene was not simply backward ignorance. Many practices had their own logic and were attempts to stay healthy within the limits of their knowledge and resources. The fear of overbathing, for example, while puzzling to us now, was based on concerns about preserving natural body oils and preventing chills, concerns rooted in observations of illness patterns of the time. As you drift towards sleep, imagine the layers of life hidden beneath those heavy clothes, the smells mingling with the hopes and fears of families trying to survive and thrive. Picture the bustling streets filled with horses, carts, and people, the noisy construction of new sewers rumbling below, and the slow clearing of the great river. In this messy, smelly, challenging world, Londoners did what humans have always done. They adapted, they innovated, and they dreamed of something better. Their struggles laid the groundwork for the clean, vibrant cities many of us take for granted today. So, as your breathing slows and the night deepens, let this story settle softly in your mind. A reminder of the past shadows, the power of human resilience, and the quiet hope that even the dirtiest problems can be cleaned up with enough care and courage. Now, as your eyes grow heavy and the world outside your window softens into darkness, take a deep, slow breath. Let the weight of centuries lift gently from your shoulders. You've wandered through the cramped, damp rooms of Victorian London, breathed in the thick, choking air of the Great Stink, and witnessed the grit and determination of those who dared to dream of cleaner streets and safer homes. The stories of sponge baths, rancid pomades, and shared cesspools might have made you cringe. But remember, those were human stories of survival, of adaptation, and of hope flickering amid hardship. Every heavy step, every bad smell, and every ingenious solution was part of a vast, intricate dance toward modern life. As you sink deeper into your own comfortable bed, surrounded by clean sheets and running water, feel a quiet gratitude for the conveniences often taken for granted. Let the courage of Joseph Bazalgette and the countless Londoners who endured their city's darkest days inspire a calm confidence that no matter how grim things get, change is possible. And with that gentle thought, let your mind drift peacefully into dreams, safe and soothed by the knowledge that history's grime gave way to progress. One brick, one pipe, and one brave soul at a time.